Summary: Mr. Bennet made no answer.
Sir William and Lady Lucas, when a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of her own beauty. Mr. Bennet, I certainly have had my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now.
Only think what an establishment it would be for one of them. Mrs.
Bennet was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous.
The business of her life was to get her daughters married, its solace was visiting and news. She had always intended to visit Mr. Bingley, though to the last always assuring his wife that he should not go. One cannot know what a man really is by the end of a fortnight's acquaintance. He went on, if we do not venture somebody else will, and after all, Mrs. Long and her nieces must stand their chance. How good it was in you, my dear Mr. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet and her 5 daughters attacked Mr. Bingley with barefaced questions, ingenious suppositions, and distant surmises, but he eluded the skill of them all, and they were at last forced to accept the second-hand intelligence of their neighbour Lady Lucas. Oh, said Lydia stoutly, I am not afraid, for though I am the youngest, I'm the tallest. Mrs. Bennet was quite disconcerted. Lady Lucas quieted her fears a little by starting the idea of his being gone to London only to get a large party for the ball, and a report soon followed that Mr. Bingley was to bring 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen with him to the assembly. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked the gentleman, but his friend Mr. Darcy soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble mien, and the report which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance, of his having 10,000 a year. Mr. Darcy danced only once with Mrs. Hurst and once with Miss Bingley, declined being introduced to any other lady, and spent the rest of the evening in walking about the room. His character was decided. Amongst the most violent against him was Mrs.
Bennet, whose dislike of his general behavior was sharpened into particular resentment by his having slighted one of her daughters.
You are dancing with the only handsome girl in the room, said Mr. Darcy, looking at the eldest Miss Bennet.
When Mr. Bingley met Miss Bingley Darcy he said, she is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me.
And he replied, you had better return to your partner and enjoy her smiles. They found Mr. Bennet still up. Oh, my dear Mr. Bennet, as she entered the room, we have had a most delightful evening, a most excellent ball. She was therefore obliged to seek another branch of the subject, and related, with much bitterness of spirit and some exaggeration, the shocking rudeness of Mr. Darcy. Oh, you are a great deal too apt, you know, to like people in general, says Miss Bingley as she tells her sister how much she admires Mr. Bingley.
They were in fact very fine ladies, not deficient in good humour when they were pleased, nor in the power to make themselves agreeable when they chose it, but proud and conceited.
Mr. Bingley had not been of age 2 years, when he was tempted by an accidental recommendation to look at Netherfield House.
Bingley was endeared to Darcy by the easiness, openness, and ductility of his temper.
Between him and Darcy there was a very steady friendship, in spite of great opposition of character. Bingley was sure of being liked wherever he appeared, Darcy was continually giving offence. Miss Bennet was established as a sweet girl, and their brother felt authorised to think of her as he chose. Sir William Lucas had been formerly in trade in Meryton, where he made a tolerable fortune. He was elated by his rank, but it did not render him supercilious. On the contrary, he was all attention to everybody. Mrs.
Bennet's neighbour Lady Lucas was a very good kind of woman, not too clever to be a valuable neighbour to Miss Bennet.
Mr. Darcy is not so well worth listening to as his friend, is he? Poor Eliza. To be only just tolerable? I beg you would not put it into Lizzie's head to be vexed by his ill treatment, for he is such a disagreeable man, that it would be quite a misfortune to be liked by him, says Miss Lucas. Miss Bingley told me, said Jane, that he never speaks much, unless among his intimate acquaintances. Pride relates more to our opinion of ourselves, vanity to what we would have others think of us, said Mary Bennet. If I were as rich as Mr. Darcy, cried a young Lucas, who came with his sisters, I should not care how proud I was. Miss Bennet's pleasing manners grew on the goodwill of Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley.
By Jane, this attention was received with the greatest pleasure, but Elizabeth still saw superciliousness in their treatment of everybody, hardly excepting her sister, and could not like them.
She mentioned this to her friend Miss Lucas. If a woman conceals her affection with the same skill from the object of it, she may lose the opportunity of fixing him. Bingley likes your sister undoubtedly, but he may never do more than like her, if she does not help him on. Jane should make the most of every half hour in which she can command his attention. Charlotte, if Jane were determined to get a rich husband, or any husband, I dare say I should adopt it. But these are not Jane's feelings, she is not acting by design. Elizabeth, as yet, she cannot even be certain of the degree of her own regard nor of its reasonableness. Charlotte, I wish Jane success with all my heart, but it is not sound, and that you would never act in this way yourself. But when he discovered she had a good feature in her face, he began to find it rendered uncommonly intelligent. He wanted to know more of her, and as a step towards conversing with her himself, attended to her conversation with others. Mr. Darcy had at first scarcely allowed her to be pretty. He had looked at her without admiration at the ball, and when they next met, he looked at her only to criticize. You are a very strange creature by way of a friend, always wanting me to play and sing before anybody and everybody, said Miss Lucas, as she danced with her sister Mary and brother-in-law. Very well, if it must be so, it must. And I shall keep mine to swell my song, she added, turning gravely glancing at him.
Mr. Darcy stood near them in silent indignation at such a mode of passing the evening, to the exclusion of all conversation, and was too much engrossed by his thoughts to perceive that Sir William Lucas was his neighbour, till Sir William thus began, "What a charming amusement for young people this is, Mr. Darcy. I had once had some thought of fixing in town myself, for I am fond of superior society, but I did not feel quite certain that the air of London would agree with Lady Lucas." Mr. Darcy bowed.
How long has she been such a favourite? And pray, when am I to wish you joy? She asked.
Chapter 7. Mr. Bennet's property consisted almost entirely in an estate of 2,000 a year, which, unfortunately for his daughters, was entailed, in default of heirs male, on a distant relation, and their mother's fortune, though ample for her situation in life, could but ill supply the deficiency of his.
Miss Elizabeth Bennet, repeated Miss Bingley. Mr. Darcy replied with great intrepidity, Miss Elizabeth Bennet. After listening one morning to their effusions on this subject, Mr. Bennet coolly observed, "From all that I can collect by your manner of talking, you must be two of the silliest girls in the country. If a smart young colonel, with 5 or 6,000 a year, should want one of my girls I shall not say nay to him," said the Duchess of Forster. "When they get to our age, I dare say they will not think about officers any more than we do," said Colonel Forster, "and so I do still at my heart." Mrs. Bennet was prevented replying by the entrance of the footman with a note for Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield, and the servant waited for an answer. "It is from Miss Bingley," said Jane, and then read it aloud. Mrs. Bennet. "Oh, but the gentleman will have Mr. Bingley's chaise to go to Meryton, and the Hursts have no horses to theirs." Jane was therefore obliged to go on horseback, and her mother attended her to the door with many cheerful prognostics of a bad day. Her hopes were answered when it rained hard, her sisters were uneasy for her, but her mother was delighted. That she should have walked 3 miles so early in the day, in such dirty weather, and by herself, was almost incredible to Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and Elizabeth was convinced that they held her in contempt for it. Mr. Darcy said very little, and Mr. Hurst nothing at all. Miss Bennet had slept ill, and though up, was very feverish, and not well enough to leave her room. The apothecary came, and said she had caught a violent cold, and that they must endeavour to get the better of it. She was not equal, however, to much conversation, and when Miss Bingley left them together, could attempt little besides expressions of gratitude for the extraordinary kindness she was treated with. When the clock struck 3, Elizabeth felt that she must go, and very unwillingly said so. The two ladies retired to dinner, and at 6:30 Elizabeth was summoned to dinner. Miss Bingley offered her the carriage, and she only wanted a little pressing to accept it, when Jane testified such concern in parting with her, that Miss Bingley was obliged to convert the offer of the chaise to an invitation to remain at Netherfield for the present. Her manners were pronounced to be very bad indeed, a mixture of pride and impertinence. She had no conversation, no style, no beauty. Her dirty petticoat was described as 6 inches deep in mud, I am absolutely certain, and her hair was said to be so untidy, so blousy. Mrs. Hurst added, she has nothing, in short, to recommend her, but being an excellent walker. She really looked almost wild. Mrs.
Hurst and her sister Elizabeth were laughing heartily at the expense of their dear friend's vulgar relations, as they nursed ill Jane Bennet in her illness.
I am afraid, Mr. Darcy, observed Miss Bingley, that this adventure has rather affected your admiration of her fine eyes. Not at all, he replied, they were brightened by the exercise.
She was still very poorly, and Elizabeth would not quit her at all, till late in the evening when she had the comfort of seeing her sleep.
Mr. Darcy's library at Pemberley has been the work of many generations, and I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these, said Mr. Bingley. Elizabeth thanked him from her heart, and then walked towards the table where a few books were lying.
He immediately offered to fetch her others, all that his library afforded.
I wish my collection were larger for your benefit and my own credit, he said, but I am an idle fellow, and though I have not many, I have more than I ever looked into. I scarcely know anyone who cannot do all this, and I am sure I never heard a young lady spoken of for the first time, without being informed that she was very accomplished. Your list of the common extent of accomplishments, said Darcy, has too much truth.
The word is applied to many a woman who deserve it no otherwise than by netting a purse.
Elizabeth passed the chief of the night in her sister's room, and in the morning had a tolerable answer to inquiries from Mr. Bingley and his housekeeper. She asked to have a note sent to Longbourn, desiring her mother to visit Jane, and form her own judgment of her situation. Mrs. Bennet, accompanied by her 2 youngest girls, reached Netherfield soon after the family breakfast. Mrs. Bennet met Mr. Bingley with hopes that she had not found Miss Bennet worse than she expected. After sitting a little while with Jane, on Miss Bingley's appearance and invitation, the mother and 3 daughters all attended her into the breakfast parlour. She is a great deal too ill to be moved. Mr. Jones says we must not think of moving her. We must trespass a little longer on your kindness, said Mrs. Bennet. I wish I might take this for a compliment, but to be so easily seen through I am afraid is pitiful, he replied. There is quite as much of that going on in the county as in town, she said, and few neighbourhoods larger. Elizabeth asked her mother if Charlotte Lucas had been at Longbourn since her coming away. No, she would go home. I fancy she was wanted about the mince pies, said Mr. Darcy. She seems a very pleasant young woman, but you must own she is very plain. Lady Lucas herself has often said so, and envied me Jane's beauty, said Elizabeth of her mother. I do not like to boast of my own child, but to be sure, Jane, one does not often see anybody better looking.
Lydia Bennet taxed Mr. Bingley with having promised on his first coming into the country to give a ball at Netherfield, and reminded him of his promise, adding, that it would be the most shameful thing in the world if he did not keep it. Oh, yes, it would be much better to wait till Jane was well, and by that time most likely Captain Carter would be at Meryton again, said Mrs.
Bennet. Lydia declared herself satisfied.
I shall tell Colonel Forster it will be quite a shame if he does not. Elizabeth returned to Jane's room, where she found Mr. Darcy engrossed in a letter to his sister, and Miss Bingley constantly calling his attention by messages to her sister. Mrs.
Hurst and Mr. Bingley spent hours with the invalid, who continued, though slowly, to mend. Elizabeth took up needlework, amused by the interludes between Darcy and his companion.
Mr. Darcy's letters to Miss Bennet are generally long and charming, says Caroline Bingley, but whether they are always charming is not for me to determine.
That will not do for a compliment to Darcy, Caroline, cried her brother, because he does not write with ease. He studies too much for words of 4 syllables. I believe what I said of myself to be true, and I believe it at this moment, says Mr. Darcy, and I did not assume the character of needless precipitance merely to show off before the ladies. I am exceedingly gratified,
said Bingley, by your converting what my friend says into a compliment on the sweetness of my temper. To yield readily, easily, to the persuasion of a friend is no merit with you, replied Elizabeth, and to yield without conviction is no compliment to the understanding of either. I declare I do not know a more awful object than Mr. Darcy, said Mr. Bennet, when asked to marry Mr. Bingley. By all means, cried Bingley, let us hear all the particulars, not forgetting their comparative height and size. If you and Miss Bennet will defer yours till I am out of the room, I shall be very thankful, and then you may say whatever you like of me. After playing some Italian songs, Miss Bingley varied the charm by a lively Scotch air, and soon afterwards Mr. Darcy, drawing near Elizabeth, said to her, do not you feel a great inclination, Miss Bennet, to seize such an opportunity of dancing a reel? Oh, said she, I always delight in overthrowing those kind of schemes, and cheating a person of their premeditated contempt, he replied, indeed I do not dare. Miss Bingley saw, or suspected enough to be jealous, and her great anxiety for the recovery of her dear friend Jane received some assistance from her desire of getting rid of Elizabeth. Elizabeth, having rather expected to affront him, was amazed at his gallantry, but there was a mixture of sweetness and archness in her manner which made it difficult for her to affront anybody, and Darcy had never been so bewitched by any woman as he was by her. I did not know that you intended to walk, said Miss Bingley, in some confusion, lest they had been overheard. When the ladies removed after dinner, Elizabeth ran up to her sister, and seeing her well guarded from cold, attended her into the drawing room. Mr. Darcy felt their rudeness, and immediately said, this walk is not wide enough for our party.
We had better go into the avenue.
But Elizabeth, who had not the least inclination to remain with them, laughingly answered, no, no, stay where you are.
The picturesque would be spoilt by admitting a fourth.
He addressed himself to Miss Bennet, with a polite congratulation. Mr. Hurst also made her a slight bow, and said he was very glad, but diffuseness and warmth remained for Bingley's salutation. Darcy took up a book, Miss Bingley did the same, and Mrs. Hurst, principally occupied in playing with her bracelets and rings, joined now and then in her brother's conversation with Miss Bennet. He was invited to join their party, but declined, observing that he could imagine but two motives for their choosing to walk up and down the room together, with either of which motives his joining them would interfere.
Miss Bingley resolved on one effort more, and, turning to Elizabeth, said, let me persuade you to follow my example, and take a turn about the room. Miss Bingley made no answer, and soon afterwards she got up and walked about the room. Her figure was elegant, and she walked well, but Darcy, at whom it was all aimed, was still inflexibly studious. Oh, shocking, cried Miss Bingley.
Elizabeth Darcy, we can all plague and punish one another, if you please, by attempting to laugh without a subject.
But upon my honor, I do not.
Tease calmness of manner and presence of mind. No, no, I feel he may defy us there. Do let us have a little music, cried Miss Bingley, tired of a conversation in which she had no share. Implacable resentment is a shade in a character.
But you have chosen your fault well. You are safe from me, said Mr. Darcy. That is a failing indeed, cried Elizabeth.
In consequence of an agreement between the sisters, Elizabeth wrote the next morning to their mother, to beg that the carriage might be sent for them in the course of the day.
Their mother, Mrs.
Bennet, wanted them to stay at Netherfield till the following Tuesday, which would exactly finish Jane's week, but she could not bring herself to receive them with pleasure before.
Miss Bennet begged their mother to send a carriage for them in the course of the day, but Mrs. Bennet was impatient to get them home, and said they could not possibly have the carriage before Tuesday.
Miss Bingley was then sorry she had proposed the delay, for her jealousy and dislike of one sister much exceeded her affection for the other.
Mr. Darcy resolved to be particularly careful that no sign of admiration should escape him.
His behavior during the last day must have material weight in confirming or crushing it. Miss Bingley was uncivil to her, and more teasing than usual to himself. Miss Bingley's civility to Elizabeth increased at last very rapidly, as well as her affection for Jane, and when they parted, after assuring the latter of the pleasure it would always give her to see her either at Longbourn or Netherfield, and embracing her most tenderly, she even shook hands with the former. Jane and Elizabeth tried to explain to her the nature of an entail, but she was beyond the reach of reason.
She continued to rail bitterly against the cruelty of settling an estate away from a family of 5 daughters to a man whom nobody cared anything about. The vicar replied, "No, that I am sure I shall not, and I think it is very impertinent of him to write to you at all. There, Mrs.
Bennet, if you should have no objection to receive me into your house, I propose myself the satisfaction of waiting on you and your family, Monday, November 18th, by 4 o'clock, and shall probably trespass on your hospitality till the Saturday se'nnight following, which I can do without any inconvenience, as Lady Catherine is far from objecting to my occasional absence on a Sunday, provided that some other clergyman is engaged to do the duty of the day." Elizabeth was chiefly struck by his extraordinary deference for Lady Catherine, and his kind intention of christening, marrying, and burying his parishioners whenever it were required. Mr. Collins was a tall, heavy-looking young man of 25.
His air was grave and stately, and his manners were very formal. Mr. Bennet indeed said little, but the ladies were ready to talk, and Mr. Collins seemed neither in need of encouragement, nor inclined to be silent himself. But he was set right there by Mrs. Bennet, who assured him with some asperity that her daughters had nothing to do in the kitchen. Lady Catherine the Borough's attention to his wishes, and consideration for his comfort, appeared very remarkable. Lady Catherine was reckoned proud by many people he knew, but he had never seen anything but affability in her. Lady Catherine the Bourgh is far superior to the handsomest of her sex, says Lady Catherine Bennet.
Mr. Bennet, I am happy on every occasion to offer those little delicate compliments which are always acceptable to ladies.
Lady Catherine's daughter, the heiress of Rosings Park, has a sickly constitution, which has prevented her from making progress in many accomplishments which she could not have otherwise failed of, Lady Catherine says.
Mr. Bennet, they arise chiefly from what is passing at the time, and though I sometimes amuse myself with suggesting and arranging such little elegant compliments as may be adapted to ordinary occasions, I always wish to give them as unstudied an air as possible. Mr. Collins, my cousin, was as absurd as he had hoped, and he listened to him with the keenest enjoyment, maintaining at the same time the most resolute composure of countenance, and, except in an occasional glance at Elizabeth, requiring no partner in his pleasure. Lydia, do you know, Mamma, that my Uncle Philip talks of turning away Richard?
Lady Catherine the Bourgh and her daughters apologized most civilly for Lydia's interruption.
Mr. Collins, after assuring them that he bore his cousin no ill will, seated himself at another table with Mr. Bennet and played backgammon. He was not a sensible man, and the deficiency of nature had been but little assisted by education or society, and though he belonged to one of the universities, he had merely kept the necessary terms, without forming at it any useful acquaintance.
Miss Bennet's lovely face confirmed Mr. Collins's views, and established all his strictest notions of what was due to seniority.
His plan did not vary on seeing Miss Bennet, for the first evening she was his settled choice.
The next morning, however, made an alteration, for in a quarter of an hour's tete-a-tete with Mrs. Bennet he warned her against Jane Bennet, and said Elizabeth Bennet might be found for him at Longbourn. This was exactly as it should be, for the young man wanted only regimentals to make him completely charming. But when they were arrested by the sight of the stranger, both changed color, one looked white, the other red. Bingley was the principal spokesman, and Miss Bennet the principal object. Mr. Darcy corroborated it with a bow, and was beginning to determine not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth, when they were suddenly arrested by the sight of the stranger, and Elizabeth, happening to see the countenance of both as they looked at each other, was all astonishment at the effect of the meeting. Mrs.
Phillips was always glad to see her nieces, and the two eldest, from their recent absence, were particularly welcome, and she was eagerly expressing her surprise at their sudden return home, which, as their own carriage had not fetched them, she should have known nothing about, if she had not happened to see Mr. Jones's shop boy in the street, who had told her that they were not to send any more drafts to Netherfield because the Miss Bennets were come away, when her civility was claimed towards Mr. Collins by Jane's introduction of him.
Mrs. Phillips said she had been watching him for an hour as he walked up and down the street, and had Mr. Wickham appeared her nieces would certainly have continued the occupation. But no one passed windows now except a few of the officers, who, in comparison with the stranger, were become stupid, disagreeable fellows.
As they walked home, Elizabeth related to Jane what she had seen pass between the two gentlemen, but though Jane would have defended either or both, had they appeared to be in the wrong, she could no more explain such behavior than her sister. He protested that, except Lady Catherine and her daughter, he had never seen a more elegant woman, for she had not only received him with the utmost civility, but even pointedly included him in her invitation for the next evening, although utterly unknown to her before.
Mr. Collins on his return highly gratified Mrs. Bennet by admiring Mrs.
Phillips's manners and politeness. In describing to her all the grandeur of Lady Catherine and her mansion, with occasional digressions in praise of his own humble abode, and the improvements it was receiving, he was happily employed until the gentlemen joined them, and he found in Mrs.
Phillips a very attentive listener, whose opinion of his consequence increased with what she heard, and who was resolving to retail it all among her neighbors as soon as she could. You may well be surprised, Miss Bennet, at such an assertion, after seeing, as you probably might, the very cold manner of our meeting yesterday. Elizabeth could not but look surprised. Are you much acquainted with Mr. Darcy? You will not find him more favorably spoken of by anyone. His father, Miss Bennet, the late Mr. Darcy, was one of the best men that ever breathed, and the truest friend I ever had, and I can never be in company with this Mr. Darcy without being grieved to the soul by 1,000 tender recollections.
Elizabeth found the interest of the subject increase, and listened with all her heart, but the delicacy of it prevented further inquiry.
He was my godfather, and excessively attached to me. He meant to provide for me amply, but when the living fell, it was given elsewhere, he tells her. Good heavens! Cried Elizabeth. But how could that be? Yes, the late Mr. Darcy bequeathed me the next presentation of the best living in his gift. Elizabeth Darcy, I cannot but attribute in some measure to jealousy. Wickham, some time or other he will be, but it shall not be by me. Till I can forget and expose him, I can never defy or expose him.
Elizabeth, he had not a temper to bear the sort of competition in which we stood. Mr. Darcy's abominable pride has led him to be liberal and generous, says his sister-in-law Elizabeth. Wickham, almost all his actions may be traced to pride, and pride has connected him nearer with virtue than any other feeling.
Elizabeth Bennet, I wish I could call her amiable, but she is too much like her brother, very, very proud.
Mr. Darcy, how can Mr. Bingley, who seems good humor itself, be in friendship with such a man?
How can they suit each other? He is a very different man from what he is to the less prosperous Lady Catherine de Bourgh, she replied, has very lately given him a living. You know of course that Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Lady Annie Darcy were sisters, consequently that she is aunt to the present Mr. Darcy. This information made Elizabeth smile, as she thought of poor Miss Bingley.
Mr. Collins, said she, speaks highly both of Lady Catherine and her daughter, but from some particulars that he has related of her ladyship, I suspect his gratitude misleads him, and that in spite of her being his patroness, she is an arrogant, conceited woman. Elizabeth related to Jane the next day what had passed between Mr. Wickham and herself. My dearest Lizzie, do but consider in what a disgraceful light it places Mr. Darcy, to be treating his father's favourite in such a manner, one whom his father had promised to provide for. Mr. Bingley and his sisters invited them to a ball at Netherfield, which was fixed for the following Tuesday. The two ladies were delighted to see each other again, but paid little attention to the rest of the family. To the rest of the family they paid little attention, avoiding Mrs. Bennet as much as possible, saying not much to Elizabeth, and nothing at all to the others. Jane pictured to herself a happy evening in the society of her two friends, and the attentions of their brother, and Elizabeth thought with pleasure of dancing a great deal with Mr. Wickham, and of seeing a confirmation of everything in Mr. Darcy's look and behavior. Elizabeth's spirits were so high on this occasion, that though she did not often speak unnecessarily to Mr. Collins, she could not help asking him whether he intended to accept Mr. Bingley's invitation, and if he did, whether he would think it proper to join in the evening's amusement, and she was rather surprised to find that he entertained no scruple whatever on that head, and was very far from dreading a rebuke either from the Archbishop, or Lady Catherine de Bourgh, by venturing to dance. Miss Bennet was delighted to be selected from among her sisters as worthy of being mistress of Hunsford Parsonage, and of assisting to form a quadrille table at Rosings in the absence of more eligible visitors. The idea soon reached to conviction, as she observed his increasing civilities toward herself, and heard his frequent attempt at a compliment on her wit and vivacity, and though more astonished than gratified herself by this effect of her charms, it was not long before her mother gave her to understand that the probability of their marriage was extremely agreeable to her. She did not choose to take the hint, being well aware that a serious dispute must be the consequence of any reply. Elizabeth, however, did not choose to take the hint, being well aware that a serious dispute must be the consequence of any reply. The certainty of meeting him had not been checked by any of those recollections that might not unreasonably have alarmed her.
But in an instant arose the dreadful suspicion of his being purposely omitted for Mr. Darcy's pleasure in the Bingleys' invitation to the officers.
This part of his intelligence, though unheard by Lydia, was caught by Elizabeth, and, as it assured her that Darcy was not less answerable for Wickham's absence than if her first surmise had been just, every feeling of displeasure against the former was so sharpened by immediate disappointment, that she could hardly reply with tolerable civility to the polite inquiries which he directly afterwards approached to make.
Elizabeth Darcy danced with Mr. Collins, awkward and solemn, apologizing instead of attending, and often moving wrong without being aware of it. But she was soon able to make a voluntary transition to the oddities of her cousin, and to point him out to her particular notice. She danced next with an officer, and had the refreshment of talking of Wickham, and of hearing that he was universally liked. Charlotte warned her not to be a simpleton, and allow herself to be made unpleasant in the eyes of a man 10 times his consequence.
Elizabeth made no answer, and took her place in the set, amazed at the dignity to which she was arrived in being allowed to stand opposite to her partner. After a pause of some minutes, she addressed him a second time with, "It is your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy."
"How near it may be to mine, I cannot pretend to say. You think it a faithful portrait undoubtedly. I must not decide on my own performance." A deeper shade of hauteur overspread his features, but he said not a word, and Elizabeth, though blaming herself for her own weakness, could not go on. "I appeal to Mr. Darcy, but let me not interrupt you, sir."
The latter part of this address was scarcely heard by Darcy, but Sir William's allusion to his friend seemed to strike him forcibly, and his eyes were directed with a very serious expression towards Bingley and Jane, who were dancing together. "I can readily believe," answered he gravely, "that reports may vary greatly with respect to me, and I could wish, Miss Bennet, that you were not to sketch my character at the present moment, as there is reason to fear that the performance would reflect no credit on either. I pity you, Miss Eliza, for this discovery of your favourite's guilt," said the Duchess of Bingley. "Considering his descent, one could not expect much better." They had not long separated, when Miss Bingley came towards her, and with an expression of civil disdain accosted her. "So, Miss Eliza, I hear you are quite delighted with George Wickham. Let me recommend you, however, as a friend, not to give implicit confidence to all his assertions, for as to Mr. Darcy's using him ill, it is perfectly false, for, on the contrary, he has always been remarkably kind to him, though George Wickham has treated Mr. Darcy in a most infamous manner."
"Insolent girl," said Elizabeth to herself. "This account then is what he has received from Mr. Darcy. My total ignorance of the connection must plead my apology," says Mrs. Darcy. "I believe him to be Lady Catherine's nephew." Elizabeth listened with delight to the happy, though modest hopes which Jane entertained of Mr. Bingley's regard, and said all in her power to heighten her confidence in it.
Elizabeth tried hard to dissuade him from such a scheme, assuring him that Mr. Darcy would consider his addressing him without introduction as an impertinent freedom, rather than a compliment to his aunt, that it was not in the least necessary there should be any notice on either side, and that if it were, it must belong to Mr. Darcy, the superior in consequence, to begin the acquaintance. Mr. Collins listened to her with the determined air of following his own inclination, and, when she ceased speaking, replied thus: "My dear Miss Elizabeth, I have the highest opinion in the world in your excellent judgment in all matters within the scope of your understanding, but permit me to say, that there must be a wide difference between the established forms of ceremony amongst the laity, and those which regulate the clergy. For, give me leave to observe that I consider the clerical office as equal in point of dignity with the highest rank in the kingdom, provided that a proper humility of behavior is at the same time maintained.
Mr. Collins replied with an air of distant civility, I consider myself more fitted to decide on what is right than a young lady like you.
Her cousin prefaced his speech with a solemn bow, and though she could not hear a word of it, she felt as if hearing it all, and saw in the motion of his lips the words, apology, Hunsford, and Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Mr. Collins then returned to Elizabeth, and with a low bow he left her to attack Mr. Darcy, whose reception of his advances she eagerly watched, and whose astonishment at being so addressed was very evident.
Mr. Darcy replied, I have no reason, I assure you, to be dissatisfied with my reception.
He answered me with the utmost civility, and even paid me the compliment of saying that he was so well convinced of Lady Catherine's discernment as to be certain she could never bestow a favour unworthily. As Elizabeth had no longer any interest of her own to pursue, she turned her attention almost entirely on her sister and Mr. Bingley, and the train of agreeable reflections which her observations gave birth to, made her perhaps almost as happy as Jane. It was an animating subject, and Mrs.
Bennet seemed incapable of fatigue while enumerating the advantages of the match. She concluded with many good wishes that Lady Lucas might soon be equally fortunate, though evidently and triumphantly believing there was no chance of it.
Elizabeth Bennet, I am sure we owe Mr. Darcy no such particular civility as to be obliged to say nothing he may not like to hear. For heaven's sake, madam, speak lower.
What advantage can it be for you to offend him?
You will never recommend yourself to his friend by so doing?
Mrs.
Bennet and Lady Lucas, who had been long yawning at the repetition of delights which she saw no likelihood of sharing, were left to their comforts of cold ham and chicken. Elizabeth was in agonies. She looked at his two sisters, and saw them making signs of derision at each other, and at Darcy, who continued, however, imperturbably grave.
Elizabeth Darcy felt her anxiety had done no good.
Many stared, many smiled, but no one looked more amused than Mr. Bennet himself, while his wife seriously commended Mr. Collins for having spoken so sensibly, and observed in a half-whisper to Lady Lucas, that he was a remarkably clever, good kind of young man. The rest of the evening brought her little amusement, as she was teased by Mr. Collins, who continued most perseveringly by her side, and put it out of her power to dance with others. She was at least free from the offence of Mr. Darcy's further notice, though often standing within a very short distance of her, quite disengaged, he never came near enough to speak. The Bennet family had to wait for their carriage after everybody else was gone.
Elizabeth preserved as steady a silence as either Mrs.
Hurst or Miss Bingley, and even Lydia was too much fatigued to utter more than the occasional exclamation of, Lord, how tired I am, accompanied by a violent yawn.
Darcy said nothing at all. And, gathering her work together, she was hastening away, when Elizabeth called out, Dear madam, do not go.
Before Elizabeth had time for anything but a blush of surprise, Mrs.
Bennet answered instantly, Oh dear, yes, certainly. Believe me, my dear Miss Elizabeth, that your modesty, so far from doing you any disservice, rather adds to your other perfections.
He went on, I am convinced that it will add very greatly to my happiness, and thirdly that it is the particular advice and recommendation of the very noble lady whom I have the honor of calling patroness unasked to, that you must marry. Lady Catherine de Bourgh. I do not reckon the notice and kindness of Lady Catherine as among the least of the advantages in my power to offer you. As I am to inherit this estate after the death of your honored father, I could not satisfy myself without resolving to choose a wife from among his daughters, that the loss to them might be as little as possible, when the melancholy event takes place.
You could not make me happy, and I am convinced that I am the last woman in the world who could make you so, she said.
Nay, were your friend Lady Catherine to know me, I am persuaded she would find me in every respect ill qualified for the situation. Upon my word, sir, cried Elizabeth, your hope is a rather extraordinary one after my declaration.
Elizabeth of Longbournemouth, Mr. Collins, all praise of me will be unnecessary. You must give me leave to judge for myself, and pay me the compliment of believing what I say.
Mr. Collins, I wish you very happy and very rich, and by refusing your hand, do all in my power to prevent your being otherwise. Elizabeth, if what I have hitherto said can appear to you in the form of encouragement, I know not how to convince you of its being one.
He said, I do assure you, sir, that I have no pretensions whatever to that my hand is unworthy of your acceptance, or that the establishment I can offer would in all likelihood undo the effects of your loveliness and amiable qualifications.
To such perseverance in wilful self-deception Elizabeth would make no reply, and immediately and in silence withdrew, determined, if he persisted in considering her repeated refusals as flattering encouragement, to apply to her father, whose negative might be uttered in such a manner as to be decisive, and whose behavior at least could not be mistaken for the affectation and coquetry of an elegant female. Mr. Collins was not left long to the silent contemplation of his successful love, for Mrs. Bennet, having dawdled about in the vestibule to watch for the end of the conference, no sooner saw Elizabeth open the door and with quick step pass her towards the staircase, than she entered the breakfast room, and congratulated both him and herself in warm terms on the happy prospect of their nearer connection.
Mrs.
Bennet said she believed her daughter had intended to encourage him by rejecting him, but she dared not believe it, and could not help saying so. You must come and make Lizzie marry Mr. Collins, for she vows she will not have him.
She would not give him time to reply, but hurrying instantly to her husband, called out as she entered the library, Oh, Mr. Bennet, you are wanted immediately? Elizabeth replied that it was.
Mr. Collins thought too well of himself to comprehend what motives his cousin could have to refuse him.
She talked to Elizabeth again and again, coaxed and threatened her by turns. Not yet, however, in spite of her disappointment in her husband, did Mrs. Bennet give up the point. Aye, there she comes, continued Mrs. Bennet, looking as unconcerned as may be, and caring no more for us than if we were at York, provided she can have her own way. Mrs. Bennet, if you take it into your head to go on refusing every offer of marriage in this way, you will never get a husband at all. I shall not be able to keep you when your father is dead. When Elizabeth Bennet rebuffed Mr. Collins's offer of marriage to her cousin Miss Lucas, he said, Resignation is never so perfect as when the blessing denied begins to lose somewhat of its value in our estimation.
He went on, My conduct may, I fear, be objectionable in having accepted my dismission from your daughter's lips instead of your own. Soon after their return, a letter was delivered to Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield. The envelope contained a sheet of elegant, little, hot-pressed paper, well covered with a lady's fair, flowing hand, and Elizabeth saw her sister's countenance change as she read it, and saw her dwelling intently on some particular passages. I found, said he, as the time drew near that I had better not meet Mr. Darcy, that to be in the same room, the same party with him for so many hours together, might be more than I could bear, and that scenes might arise unpleasant to more than myself. I do not pretend to regret anything I shall leave in Hertfordshire, except your society, my dearest friend, but we will hope, at some future period, to enjoy many returns of that delightful intercourse we have known, and in the meanwhile may lessen the pain of separation by a very frequent and most unreserved correspondence, she wrote. To these high-flown expressions Elizabeth listened with all the insensibility of distrust, and though the suddenness of their removal surprised her, she saw nothing in it really to lament. It was not to be supposed that their absence from Netherfield would prevent Mr. Bingley's being there, and as to the loss of their society, she was persuaded that Jane must cease to regard it, in the enjoyment of his. Jane Bingley's sister, Jane, sent a letter to her brother's family from Hertfordshire. I sincerely hope your Christmas will abound in the gaieties which that season generally brings, and that your beaux will be so numerous as to prevent your feeling the loss of the three of whom we shall deprive you of. Mr. Darcy's sister-in-law Jane Austen. I really do not think Georgiana Darcy has her equal for beauty, elegance, and accomplishments, and the affection she inspires in Louisa and myself is heightened into something still more interesting, from the hope we dare entertain of her being hereafter our sister. I will have no reserves from you. If she suspects the nature of my feelings for him, she means, most kindly,
to put me on my guard, she says. But the case is this, we are not rich enough or grand enough for them, and she is the more anxious to get Miss Darcy for her brother, from the notion that when there has been one intermarriage, she may have less trouble in achieving a second, in which there is certainly some ingenuity, and I dare say it would succeed, if Miss de Bourgh were out of the way.
You must decide for yourself, said Elizabeth, and if he returns no more this winter, my choice will never be required. The idea of his returning no more was treated with the utmost contempt by Elizabeth Bennet. The Bennets were engaged to dine with the Lucases, and again during the chief of the day was Miss Lucas so kind as to listen to Mr. Collins.
Miss Lucas was so kind as to listen to Mr. Collins's addresses that Elizabeth thanked her for keeping him in good humour. The whole family, in short, were properly overjoyed on the occasion. Sir William gave it as his decided opinion that both he and his wife should make their appearance at St. James's.
Lady Lucas began directly to calculate, with more interest than the matter had ever excited before, how many years longer Mr. Bennet was likely to live, and Sir William gave it as his decided opinion, that whenever Mr. Collins should be in possession of the Longbourn estate, it would be highly expedient that both he and his wife should make their appearance at St. James's. Elizabeth Bennet felt her feelings must be hurt by such a disapprobation from her friend. They were all astonished, and Mr. Bennet, who could by no means wish for so speedy a return, immediately said, "But is there not danger of Lady Catherine's disapprobation here, my good sir?"
"My dear Charlotte, impossible." Mrs. Bennet wanted to understand by it that he thought of paying his addresses to one of her younger girls, and Mary might have been prevailed on to accept him. She rated his abilities much higher than any of the others. There was a solidity in his reflections which often struck her, and though by no means so clever as herself, she thought that if encouraged by such an example as hers, he might become a very agreeable companion. Miss Lucas called soon after breakfast, and in a private conference with Elizabeth related the event of the day before. Elizabeth Bennet, I am not romantic, you know, I never was.
I ask only a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins's character, connection, and situation in life, I am convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the married state. Sir William, how can you tell such a story?
Do not you know he wants to marry Lizzie?
Sir William begged leave to be positive as to the truth of his information, but he listened to all their impertinence with the most forbearing courtesy. Elizabeth, feeling it incumbent on her to relieve him from so unpleasant a situation, now put herself forward to confirm his account. She endeavored to put a stop to the exclamations of her mother and sister by making a variety of remarks on the happiness that might be expected from the match. Mr. Bennet's emotions were much more tranquil on the occasion, and such as he did experience he pronounced to be of a most agreeable sort, for it gratified him, he said, to discover that Charlotte Lucas, whom he had been used to think tolerably sensible, was as foolish as his wife, and more foolish than his daughter. Lady Lucas could not be insensible of triumph on being able to retort on Mrs.
Bennet the comfort of having a daughter well married. Kitty and Lydia were far from envying Miss Lucas, for Mr. Collins was only a clergyman, and it affected them in no other way than as a piece of news to spread at Meryton. Elizabeth felt persuaded that no real confidence could ever subsist between her and Charlotte Bennet again. Her disappointment in Charlotte made her turn with fonder regard to her sister, of whose rectitude and delicacy she was sure her opinion could never be shaken. Bingley had now been gone a week and nothing more was heard of his return.
Jane had sent Caroline an early answer to her letter, and was counting the days till she might reasonably hope to hear again.
Lady Lucas could not be insensible of triumph on being able to retort on Mrs. Bennet the comfort of having a daughter well married, and she called at Longbourn rather oftener than usual to say how happy she was, though Mrs. Bennet's sour looks and ill-natured remarks might have been enough to drive happiness away.
As for Jane, her anxiety under this suspense was, of course, more painful than Elizabeth's, but whatever she felt she was desirous of concealing, and between herself and Elizabeth, therefore, the subject was never alluded to. The united efforts of his two unfeeling sisters and of his overpowering friend, assisted by the attractions of Miss Darcy and the amusements of London might be too much, she feared, for the strength of his attachment. Day after day passed away without bringing any other tidings of him than the report which shortly prevailed in Meryton of his coming no more to Netherfield the whole winter, a report which highly incensed Mrs.
Bennet, and which she never failed to contradict as a most scandalous falsehood. The sight of Miss Lucas was odious to her as her successor in that house, and she regarded her with jealous abhorrence.
She complained bitterly of all this to her husband, and said, how anyone could have the conscience to entail away an estate from one's own daughters?
I leave it to yourself to determine, said Mr. Bennet. Her heart was divided between concern for her and resentment of all others. She could think of nothing else but how her brother's affections had died away or were suppressed by his friend's interference. Elizabeth, to whom Jane very soon communicated the chief of all this, heard it in silent indignation.
Miss Darcy's praise occupied the chief of it.
A day or two passed before Jane had courage to speak of her feelings to Elizabeth, but at last, on Mrs.
Bennet's leaving them together, after a longer irritation than usual about Netherfield and its master, she could not help saying, oh, that my dear mother had more command over herself. My dear Jane, Mr. Collins is a conceited, pompous, narrow-minded, silly man, you know he is, as much as I do, said Charlotte Lucas to her cousin Lizzie. Elizabeth I, I am far from attributing any part of Mr. Bingley's conduct to design, but without scheming to do wrong, there may be error, and there may also be misery.
Elizabeth II, it is very often nothing but our own vanity that deceives us, she says. Mrs. Bennet replied, do not distress me by the idea. I am not ashamed of having been mistaken. Elizabeth could not oppose such a wish, and from this time Mr. Bingley's name was scarcely ever mentioned between them. Beyond a doubt, they do wish him to choose Miss Darcy, replied Jane, but this may be from better feelings than you are supposing. Mr. Darcy was condemned as the worst of men by his family and friends, but Mr. Bennet treated the matter differently. So, Lizzie, said he one day, your sister is crossed in love, I find. Mrs. Bennet had many grievances to relate, and much to complain of. Lady Lucas will have a daughter married before I have, and the Longbourn estate is just as much entailed as ever. The Lucases are very artful people indeed, sister. They are all for what they can get. When they were alone, Elizabeth said, we do not suffer by accident. These sort of inconsistencies are very frequent.
But in spite of the certainty in which Elizabeth affected to place this point, as well as the still more interesting one of Bingley's being withheld from seeing Jane, she felt a solicitude on the subject which convinced her, on examination, that she did not consider it entirely hopeless. And that is quite impossible, for he is now in the custody of his friend, and Mr. Darcy would no more suffer him to call on Jane in such a part of London. Miss Bennet accepted her aunt's invitation with pleasure, and the Bingleys were no otherwise in her thoughts at the same time, than as she hoped by Caroline's not living in the same house with her brother, she might occasionally spend a morning with her, without any danger of seeing him.
The Gardiners stayed a week at Longbourn, and what with the Phillipses, the Lucases, and the officers, there was not a day without its engagement. Mrs.
Gardner's caution to Elizabeth was punctually and kindly given on the first favourable opportunity of speaking to her alone. After honestly telling her what she thought, she thus went on being made acquainted with the present Mr. Darcy's treatment of him, she tried to remember some of that gentleman's reputed disposition when quite a lad which might agree with it, and was confident at last that she recollected having heard Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy formerly spoken of as a very proud, ill-natured boy.
Mrs. Bennet had so carefully provided for the entertainment of her brother and sister, that they did not once sit down to a family dinner.
Elizabeth, you are too sensible a girl, Lizzie, to fall in love merely because you are warned against it, writes Aunt Elizabeth.
I beg your pardon, I will try again. At present I am not in love with Mr. Wickham. No, I certainly am not. He shall not be in love if I can prevent it.
Elizabeth Bennet, oh, that abominable Mr. Darcy. My father's opinion of me does me the greatest honor, and I should be miserable to forfeit it. Her aunt, if he becomes really attached to me, I believe it will be better that he should not.
I see the imprudence of it. Mr. Collins returned into Hertfordshire soon after it had been quitted by the Gardiners and Jane, but as he took up his abode with the Lucases, his arrival was no great inconvenience to Mrs. Bennet.
Elizabeth could not refuse, though she foresaw little pleasure in the visit. She could never address her without feeling that all comfort was over, and though determined not to slacken as a correspondent, it was for the sake of what had been, rather than what was.
Charlotte's first letters were received with a good deal of eagerness, and she expressed herself exactly as she might have foreseen.
The house, furniture, neighborhood, and roads were all to her taste, and Lady Catherine's behavior was most friendly and obliging.
Elizabeth could never address her without feeling that all the comfort of intimacy was over, and though determined not to slacken as a correspondent, it was for the sake of what had been, rather than what was. Elizabeth shook her head over this letter. He was well, but so much engaged with Mr. Darcy that they scarcely ever saw him.
Caroline Darcy, I do not at all comprehend her reason for wishing to be intimate with me, but if the same circumstances were to happen again, I am sure I should be deceived again.
When she did come, it was very evident that she had no pleasure in it. She made a slight, formal apology for not calling before, said not a word of wishing to see me again, and was in every respect so altered a creature, that when she went away I was perfectly resolved to continue the acquaintance no longer. She was very wrong in singling me out as she did. I can safely say that every advance to intimacy began on her side. But I pity her, because she must feel that she has been acting wrong, and because anxiety for her brother is the cause of it.
Every object in the next day's journey was new and interesting to Elizabeth, and her spirits were in a state of enjoyment, for she had seen her sister looking so well as to banish all fear for her health, and the prospect of her northern tour was a constant source of delight.
Mr. Collins and Charlotte appeared at the door, and the carriage stopped at the small gate which led by a short gravel walk to the house, amidst the nods and smiles of the whole party. He then invited them to take a stroll in his garden, which was large and well laid out, and to which he attended himself. To work in this garden was one of his most respectable pleasures, and Elizabeth admired the command of countenance with which Charlotte talked of the healthfulness of the exercise, and owned she encouraged it as much as possible. Lady Catherine is a very respectable, sensible woman indeed, added Charlotte, and a most attentive neighbor. It was spoken of again while they were at dinner, when Mr. Collins, joining in, observed, "Yes, Miss Elizabeth, you will have the honor of seeing Lady Catherine de Bourgh on the ensuing Sunday at church, and I need not say you will be delighted with her." "La, my dear," said Maria, quite shocked at the mistake, "it is not Lady Catherine." "And is this all?" cried Elizabeth. "Oh, Charlotte says she hardly ever does."
The power of displaying the grandeur of his patroness to his wondering visitors, and of letting them see her civility towards himself and his wife, was exactly what he had wished for, and that an opportunity of doing it should be given so soon, was such an instance of Lady Catherine's condescension, as he knew not how to admire enough. When the ladies were separating for the toilette, he said to Elizabeth, Mr. Collins no sooner saw the two girls than he began to congratulate them on their good fortune, which Charlotte explained by letting them know that the whole party was asked to dine at Rosings the next day. "Lady Catherine will not think the worse of you for being simply dressed." Elizabeth's courage did not fail her. Lady Catherine was a tall, large woman, with strongly marked features, which might once have been handsome. Her air was not conciliating, nor was her manner of receiving them such as to make her visitors forget their inferior rank. Elizabeth found herself quite equal to the scene, and could observe the three ladies before her composedly. When, after examining the mother, in whose countenance and deportment she soon found some resemblance of Mr. Darcy, she turned her eyes on the daughter, she could almost have joined in Maria's astonishment at her being so thin and so small. Lady Catherine seemed gratified by their excessive admiration, and gave most gracious smiles, especially when any dish on the table proved a novelty to them. The party did not supply much conversation, as Lady Catherine was seated between Charlotte and Miss de Bourgh. Elizabeth was ready to speak whenever there was an opening, but she was seated between Charlotte and Miss de Bourgh, the former of whom was engaged in listening to Lady Catherine, and the latter said not a word to her all dinner time. When the ladies returned to the drawing room, there was little to be done but to hear Lady Catherine talk, which she did without any intermission till coffee came in, delivering her opinion on every subject in so decisive a manner, as proved that she was not used to have her judgment controverted.
Elizabeth found that nothing was beneath this great lady's attention, which could furnish her with an occasion of dictating to others. "Do you play and sing, Miss Bennet? For your sake," turning to Charlotte, "I am glad of it, but otherwise I see no occasion for entailing estates from the female line." Lady Catherine replies, "We were always encouraged to read, and had all the masters that were necessary. Those who chose to be idle, certainly might." Elizabeth could hardly help smiling as she assured her that had not been the case.
"Are any of your younger sisters out, Miss Bennet?" Elizabeth replied, "With 3 younger sisters grown up, your ladyship can hardly expect me to own it." Lady Catherine seemed quite astonished at not receiving a direct answer. When Lady Catherine and her daughter played as long as they chose, the tables were broken up, and a carriage was offered to Mrs.
Collins. Elizabeth was called on by her cousin to give her opinion of all that she had seen at Rosings, which, for Charlotte's sake, she made more favourable than it really was.
But her commendation, though costing her some trouble, could by no means satisfy Mr. Collins, and he was very soon obliged to take her ladyship's praise into his own hands. Elizabeth soon perceived that though this great lady was not in commission of the peace of the county, she was a most active magistrate in her own parish, the minutest concerns of which were carried to her by Mr. Collins, and whenever any of the cottagers were disposed to be quarrelsome, discontented, or too poor, she sallied forth into the village to settle their differences, silence their complaints, and scold them into harmony and plenty. She not unfrequently stopped at the parsonage, and had a few minutes' conversation with Charlotte, but was scarcely ever prevailed upon to get out. Their other engagements were few, as the style of living in the neighborhood in general was beyond Mr. Collins's reach.
The entertainment of dining at Rosings was repeated about twice a week, and every such entertainment was the counterpart of the first.
Her favorite walk, and where she frequently went while the others were calling on Lady Catherine, was along the open grove which edged that side of the park, where there was a nice sheltered path, which no one seemed to value but herself, and where she felt beyond the reach of Lady Catherine's curiosity.
This, however, was no evil to Elizabeth, and upon the whole she spent her time comfortably enough. There were half hours of pleasant conversation with Charlotte, and the weather was so fine for the time of year that she had often great enjoyment out of doors.
Elizabeth had heard soon after her arrival that Mr. Darcy was expected there in the course of a few weeks, and though there were not many of her acquaintances whom she did not prefer, his coming would furnish one comparatively new to look at in their Rosings parties, and she might be amused in seeing how hopeless Miss Bingley's designs on him were, by his behaviour to his cousin, for whom he was evidently destined by Lady Catherine, who talked of his coming with the greatest satisfaction, spoke of him in terms of the highest admiration, and seemed almost angry to find that he had already been frequently seen by Miss Lucas and herself. Charlotte had seen them from her husband's room, crossing the road, and immediately running into the other, told the girls what an honor they might expect, adding, "I may thank you, Eliza, for this piece of civility." At length, however, his civility was so far awakened as to inquire of Elizabeth after the health of her family. Mr. Darcy looked just as he had been used to look in Hertfordshire, paid his compliments, with his usual reserve, to Mrs. Collins, and whatever might be his feelings toward her friend, met her with every appearance of composure. She was perfectly sensible that he never had, but she wished to see whether he would betray any consciousness of what had passed between the Bingleys and Jane, and she thought he looked a little confused as he answered that he had never been so fortunate as to meet Miss Bennet. She thought he looked a little confused as he replied that he had never been so fortunate as to meet her. For the last week they had seen very little of Lady Catherine or her daughter, Mr. Darcy and Lady Catherine. He now seated himself by her, and talked so agreeably of Kent and Hertfordshire, of travelling and staying at home, of new books and music, that Elizabeth had never been half so well entertained in that room before, and they conversed with so much spirit and flow, as to draw the attention of Lady Catherine herself, as well as of Mr. Darcy. "What are you telling Miss Bennet?" "Lady Catherine Bennet, of all subjects my delight, I must have my share in the conversation if you are speaking of music." "How does Georgiana get on, Darcy?" Mr. Darcy looked a little ashamed of his aunt's ill breeding, and made no answer.
When Colonel Fitzwilliam reminded Elizabeth of having promised to play to him, she sat down directly to the instrument.
Elizabeth laughed heartily at the picture of herself, and said to Colonel Fitzwilliam, "Your cousin will give you a very pretty notion of me, and teach you not to believe a word I say." Mr. Darcy replied, "I shall not say you are mistaken, because you could not really believe me to entertain any design of alarming you. I certainly have not the talent which some people possess," said Darcy, "of conversing easily with those I have never seen before," said Elizabeth Bennet.
Here they were interrupted by Lady Catherine, who called out to know what they were talking of.
Lady Catherine continued her remarks on Elizabeth's performance, mixing with them many instructions on execution and taste. As she had heard no carriage, she thought it not unlikely to be Lady Catherine, and under that apprehension was putting away her half-finished letter that she might escape all impertinent questions, when the door opened, and, to her very great surprise, Mr. Darcy, and Mr. Darcy only, entered the room.
"I should not be surprised," said Darcy, "if you were to give it up as soon as any eligible purchase offers."
She was afraid of talking longer of his friend, and decided to leave the trouble of finding a subject to him.
Lady Catherine, I believe, did a great deal to it when Mr. Collins first came to Hunsford. Elizabeth made no answer.
Mr. Darcy, I do not mean to say that a woman may not be settled too near her family under less than half the present distance.
Charlotte Bennet, where there is fortune to make the expenses of travelling unimportant, distance becomes no evil. But that is not the case here. Mr. and Mrs. Collins have a comfortable income, but not such a one as will allow of frequent journeys. Elizabeth looked surprised. But when Elizabeth told of his silence, it did not seem very likely, even to Charlotte's wishes, to be the case, and after various conjectures, they could at last only suppose his visit to proceed from the difficulty of finding anything to do, which was the more probable from the time of year. But when Elizabeth told them of his silence, it did not seem very likely that this was the case.
Within doors there was Lady Catherine, books, and a billiard table, but gentlemen cannot always be within doors, and in the nearness of the parsonage, or the pleasantness of the walk to it, or of the people who lived in it, the two cousins found a temptation from this period of walking thither almost every day. But why Mr. Darcy came so often to the parsonage, it was more difficult to understand. How it could occur a second time, therefore, was very odd, yet it did, and even a third. More than once did Elizabeth, in her ramble within the park, unexpectedly meet Mr. Darcy. "I do not know anybody who seems to enjoy the power of doing what he likes," he said of the Earl of Darcy. He went on, "It is only that he has better means of having it than many others, because he is rich and many others are poor." Is this, thought Elizabeth, meant for me? She colored at the idea. She went on, "I never heard any harm of her, and I dare say she is one of the most tractable creatures in the world. I am joined with him in the guardianship of Miss Darcy. Fitzwilliam, from something that Mr. Darcy told me in our journey hither, I have reason to think Bingley very much indebted to him. But I ought to beg his pardon, for I have no right to suppose that Bingley was the person meant. It was all conjecture. Hither, I have reason to think Bingley very much indebted to him. But I ought to beg his pardon, for I have no right to suppose that Bingley was the person meant. It was all conjecture. Elizabeth, Darcy does take care of Bingley in those points where he most wants care, she says." This was spoken jestingly, but it appeared to her so just a picture of Mr. Darcy, that she would not trust herself with an answer, and therefore, abruptly changing the conversation, talked on indifferent matters until they reached the parsonage. Mr. Darcy's shameful boast of what misery he had been able to inflict, gave her a keener sense of her sister's sufferings. Mrs. Collins did not press her to go, and as much as possible prevented her husband from pressing her. When they were gone, Elizabeth, as if intending to exasperate herself as much as possible against Mr. Darcy, chose for her employment the examination of all the letters which Jane had written to her since her being in Kent. After a silence of several minutes he said, "You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you." Elizabeth was surprised, but said not a word. But this idea was soon banished, and her spirits were very differently affected, when, to her utter amazement,
she saw Mr. Darcy walk into the room. She tried to compose herself to answer him with patience when he should have done. He spoke of apprehension and anxiety, but his countenance expressed real security. As he said this, she lost all compassion in anger, and said, "It is natural that obligation should be felt, and if I could feel gratitude, I would now thank you." The pause was to Elizabeth's feelings dreadful. Mr. Darcy, who was leaning against the mantelpiece with his eyes fixed on her face, seemed to catch her words with no less resentment than surprise. "Can you deny that you have done it?" she asked him. He replied, "I rejoice in my success. Towards him I have been kinder than towards myself." Elizabeth disdained the appearance of noticing this civil reflection, but its meaning did not escape, nor was it likely to conciliate her. As she pronounced these words, Mr. Darcy changed color, but the emotion was short, and he listened without attempting to interrupt her while she continued, "I have every reason in the world to think ill of you. Your character was unfolded in the recital which I received many months ago from Mr. Wickham. You have reduced him to his present state of poverty, comparative poverty," said Darcy contemptuously. Elizabeth felt herself growing more angry every moment, yet she tried to keep composure. "Elizabeth Darcy, from the beginning of my acquaintance with you, your manners, impressing me with your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain of the feelings of others, I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed on to marry. Forgive me for having taken up so much of your time, and accept my best wishes for your health and happiness." "Charlotte, you have said quite enough, madam. I perfectly comprehend your feelings, and have now only to be ashamed of what my own have been." But his pride, his abominable pride, his shameless avowal of what he had done with respect to Jane, his unpardonable assurance in acknowledging, though he could not justify it, and the unfeeling manner in which he had mentioned Mr. Wickham, his cruelty towards whom he had not attempted to deny, soon overcame the pity which the consideration of his attachment had for a moment excited. When Elizabeth Darcy awoke the next morning, she could not yet recover from the surprise of what had happened. She resolved to indulge herself in air and exercise, and went out for her favorite walk, but instead of entering the park, she turned up a lane which led farther from the turnpike road. After walking 2 or 3 times along that part of the lane, she was tempted, by the pleasantness of the morning, to stop at the gates and look into the park. She was on the point of continuing her walk, when she caught a glimpse of a gentleman within the sort of grove which edged the park. He was moving that way, and, fearful of its being Mr. Darcy, she retreated. The first mentioned was, that, regardless of the sentiments of either, I had detached Mr. Bingley from your sister, and the other, that I had, in defiance of various claims, in defiance of honor and humanity, ruined the immediate prosperity and blasted the prospects of Mr. Wickham. I had not been long in Hertfordshire, before I saw, in common with others, that Bingley preferred your elder sister to any other young woman in the country, says Sir William Lucas. From that moment I observed my friend's behavior attentively, and I could then perceive that his partiality for Miss Bennet was beyond what I had ever witnessed in him, he writes. From herself to Jane, from Jane to Bingley, her thoughts were in a line which soon brought to her recollection that Mr. Darcy's explanation there had appeared very insufficient, and she read it again. Of neither Darcy nor Wickham could she think without feeling she had been blind, partial, prejudiced, absurd. Elizabeth could not see Lady Catherine without recollecting that, had she chosen it, she might by this time have been presented to her as her future niece, nor could she think, without a smile, of what her ladyship's indignation would have been. She was immediately told that the 2 gentlemen from Rosings had each called during her absence, Mr. Darcy, only for a few minutes, to take leave, but that Colonel Fitzwilliam had been sitting with them at least an hour, hoping for her return, and almost resolving to walk after her till she could be found. I am particularly attached to these young men, and know them to be so much attached to me, she said. I am much obliged to your ladyship for your kind invitation, replied Elizabeth, but it is not in my power to accept it. The dear Colonel rallied his spirits tolerably till just at last, but Darcy seemed to feel it most acutely, more, I think, than last year. I cannot bear the idea of 2 young women travelling post by themselves, it is highly improper, said Lady Catherine. Lady Catherine had many other questions to ask respecting their journey, and as she did not answer them all herself, attention was necessary, which Elizabeth believed to be lucky for her, or, with a mind so occupied, she might have forgotten where she was. Miss Darcy, the daughter of Mr. Darcy, of Pemberley, and Lady Annie, could not have appeared with propriety in a different manner. Mr. Darcy's letter she was in a fair way of soon knowing by heart. But when she considered how unjustly she had condemned and upbraided him, her anger was turned against herself, and his disappointed feelings became the object of compassion. Elizabeth had frequently united with Jane in an endeavour to check the imprudence of Catherine and Lydia, but while they were supported by their mother's indulgence, what chance could there be of improvement? When to these recollections was added the development of Wickham's character, it may be easily believed that the happy spirits which had seldom been depressed before, were now so much affected as to make it almost impossible for her to appear tolerably cheerful. When they parted, Lady Catherine gave them directions as to the best method of packing, and was so urgent on the necessity of placing gowns in the only right way, that Maria had to undo all the work of the morning, and pack her trunk afresh. Elizabeth was eager with her thanks and assurances of happiness. Only let me assure you, my dear Miss Elizabeth, that I can from my heart most cordially wish you equal felicity in marriage. You may, in fact, carry a very favourable report of us into Hertfordshire, my dear cousin. Elizabeth added privately, and how much I shall have to conceal. Jane looked well, and Elizabeth had little opportunity of studying her spirits, amidst the various engagements which the kindness of her aunt had reserved for them. It was not without an effort, meanwhile, that she could wait even for Longbourn, before she told her sister of Mr. Darcy's proposals. It was the second week in May, in which the three young ladies set out together from Gracechurch Street for the town of in Hertfordshire, and, as they drew near the appointed inn where Mr. Bennet's carriage was to meet them, they quickly perceived, in token of the coachman's punctuality, both Kitty and Lydia looking out of a dining room upstairs. Elizabeth Wickham said of her sister Jane, "I never saw such a long chin in my life. And when I have bought some prettier coloured satin to trim it with fresh, I think it will not much signify what one wears this summer, after the Shire have left Meryton, and they are going in a fortnight, are they?" Elizabeth's sister Lydia added, "There is no danger of Wickham's marrying Mary King. She is a great fool for going away, if she liked him." "How nicely we are all crammed in," cried Lydia. Elizabeth was shocked to think that the coarseness of the sentiment was little other than her own breast had harboured and fancied liberal. "Lord, how ashamed I should be of not being married before 23, she said. "How I should like to be married before any of you, and then I would chaperone you about to all the balls. We dressed up Chamberlain in woman's clothes on purpose to pass for a lady, only think what fun. When Denny, and Wickham, and Pratt, and 2 or 3 more of the men came in, they did not know him in the least." Elizabeth listened as little as she could, but there was no escaping the frequent mention of Wickham's name. Mrs. Bennet was doubly engaged in collecting an account of the present fashions from Jane, who sat some way below her, and selling them all to the younger Lucases. Ms. Bennet says she is heartily sorry for him, but he has other feelings, which will probably soon drive away his regard for me. Elizabeth's impatience to acquaint Jane with what had happened could no longer be overcome, and at length, resolving to suppress every particular in which her sister was concerned, and preparing her to be surprised, she related to her the next morning the chief of the scene between Mr. Darcy and herself. "But you blame me for having spoken so warmly of Wickham?" she wrote back to her sister. "I do not know when I have been more shocked," she said. Jane replied, "It is almost past belief." "This will not do," said Elizabeth. "You never will be able to make both of them good for anything. And poor Mr. Darcy. Wickham so very bad. There certainly was some great mismanagement in the education of those 2 young men. One has got all the goodness, and the other all the appearance of it," writes Mr. Darcy to Lizzie. "How unfortunate that you should have used such very strong expressions in speaking of Wickham to Mr. Darcy, for now they do appear wholly undeserved," she adds. "There can be no occasion for exposing him so dreadfully," she says of her husband's character. The general prejudice against Mr. Darcy is so violent, that it would be the death of half the good people in Meryton to attempt to place him in an amiable light. Wickham will soon be gone, and therefore it will not signify to anyone here what he really is. Miss Bennet paused a little, and then replied, surely there can be no occasion for exposing him so dreadfully. The tumult of Elizabeth's mind was allayed by this conversation. She dared not relate the other half of Mr. Darcy's letter, nor explain to her sister how sincerely she had been valued by her friend. Elizabeth Bennet's mother, Mrs. Bennet, said, well, my comfort is, I am sure Jane will die of a broken heart, and then he will be sorry for what he has done. But as Elizabeth could not receive comfort from any such expectation, she made no answer. The elder Miss Bennets alone were able to eat, drink and sleep, and pursue the usual course of their employments. Elizabeth tried to be diverted by their lamentations, but all sense of pleasure was lost in shame. She felt anew the justice of his objections. She felt anew the justice of Mr. Darcy's objections, and never had she been so much disposed to pardon his interference in the views of his friend. In vain did Elizabeth attempt to make Mrs. Forster reasonable, and Jane tried to make her resigned. But Elizabeth could not help secretly advising her father not to let her go. Lydia Bennet, if you, my dear father, will not take the trouble of checking her exuberant spirits, and of teaching her that her present pursuits are not to be the business of her life, she will soon be beyond the reach of amendment. Her character will be fixed, and she will, at 16, be the most determined flirt that ever made herself or her family ridiculous, without any attraction beyond youth and a tolerable person, and, from the ignorance and emptiness of her mind, unable to ward off any portion of that universal contempt which her rage for admiration will excite. In this danger Kitty also is comprehended. Vain, ignorant, idle, and absolutely uncontrolled. Mr. Bennet replies, do not make yourself uneasy, my love. I have no such injuries to resent. With this answer Elizabeth was forced to be content, but her own opinion continued the same, and she left him disappointed and sorry. It is not in her nature, however, to increase her vexations by dwelling on them, his daughter replied. Elizabeth was now to see Mr. Wickham for the last time. Mrs. Darcy lost all concern for him in finding herself selected as the object of idle and frivolous gallantry. In essentials, I believe, he is very much what he ever was, said Elizabeth. The rest of the evening passed with the appearance, on his side, of usual cheerfulness, but with no further attempt to distinguish Elizabeth from Wickham. Wickham's alarm now appeared in a heightened complexion and agitated look. For a few minutes he was silent, till, shaking off his embarrassment, he turned to her again, and said in the gentlest of accents, you, who so well know my feeling towards Mr. Darcy, will readily comprehend how sincerely I must rejoice that he is wise enough to assume even the appearance of what is right. Lydia Bennet's parting with her family was rather noisy than pathetic. Kitty was the only one who shed tears, but she did weep from vexation and envy. Mrs. Bennet was diffuse in her good wishes for the felicity of her daughter, and impressive in her injunctions that she should not miss the opportunity of enjoying herself as much as possible. Had Elizabeth's opinion been all drawn from her own family, she could not have formed a pleasing opinion of conjugal felicity or domestic comfort. But she had never felt so strongly as now the disadvantages which must attend the children of so unsuitable a marriage. Her tour to the lakes was now the object of her happiest thoughts. It was her best consolation for all the uncomfortable hours which the discontentedness of her mother and Kitty made inevitable. Her tour to the lakes was now the object of her happiest thoughts. It was her best consolation for all the uncomfortable hours which the discontentedness of her mother and Kitty made inevitable, and could she have included Jane in the scheme, every part of it would have been perfect. When Elizabeth had rejoiced over Wickham's departure, she found little other cause for satisfaction in the loss of the regiment. But Elizabeth had something to wish for in her sister's absence. A scheme of which every part promises delight can never be successful. Elizabeth was excessively disappointed. She had set her heart on seeing the lakes, and still thought there might have been time enough. 4 weeks passed before her uncle and aunt's arrival, but they did pass away. In that county there was enough to be seen to occupy the chief of their 3 weeks, and to Mrs. Gardner. It had a peculiarly strong attraction. Elizabeth was distressed. Wickham passed all his youth there, you know. In talking over their route the evening before, Mrs. Gardner expressed an inclination to see the place again. Elizabeth said no more, but her mind could not acquiesce. The possibility of meeting Mr. Darcy, while viewing the place, instantly occurred. They climbed a hillside, and found themselves at the top of a considerable eminence, where the wood ceased, and the eye was instantly caught by a large stone building. Elizabeth was delighted. On applying to see the place, they were admitted into the hall, and Elizabeth had leisure to wonder at her being there. Elizabeth colored, and said, "A little. Does that young lady know Mr. Darcy?" She approached and saw the likeness of Mr. Wickham, suspended, amongst several other miniatures, over the mantelpiece. "I have heard much of your master's fine person," said Mrs. Gardner, looking at the picture. "It is a handsome face." Elizabeth could not help saying, "It is very much to his credit, I am sure, that you should think so." "And is Miss Darcy as handsome as her brother?" said Mrs. Gardner. This accounted to Elizabeth for Mr. Wickham's being among them. "Is your master much at Pemberley in the course of the year?" Elizabeth almost stared at her. "Can this be Mr. Darcy?" thought she. "His father was an excellent man," said Mrs. Gardner. On reaching the spacious lobby above, they were shown into a very pretty sitting room, lately fitted up with greater elegance and lightness than the apartments below, and were informed that it was but just done to give pleasure to Miss Darcy, who had taken a liking to the room when last at Pemberley. Elizabeth walked in quest of the only face whose features would be known to her. At last it arrested her, and she beheld a striking resemblance to Mr. Darcy, with such a smile over the face as she remembered to have sometimes seen when he looked at her. Their eyes met, and the cheeks of both were overspread with the deepest blush. They stood a little aloof while he was talking to their niece, who, astonished and confused, scarcely dared lift her eyes to his face. He absolutely started, and for a moment seemed immovable from surprise, but shortly recovering himself, advanced towards the party, and spoke to Elizabeth, if not in terms of perfect composure, at least of perfect civility. Had his first appearance, or his resemblance to the picture they had just been examining, been insufficient to assure the other two that they now saw Mr. Darcy, the gardener's expression of surprise, on beholding his master, must immediately have told it. The others then joined her, and expressed admiration of his figure, but Elizabeth heard not a word, and wholly engrossed by her own feelings, followed them in silence. Her coming there was the most unfortunate, the most ill-judged thing in the world. How strange it must appear to him, in what a disgraceful light might it not strike so vain a man? It might seem as if she had purposely thrown herself in his way again. They had now entered a beautiful walk by the side of the water, and every step was bringing forward a nobler fall of ground, or a finer reach of the woods to which they were approaching, but it was some time before Elizabeth was sensible of any of it, and, though she answered mechanically to the repeated appeals of her uncle and aunt, and seemed to direct her eyes to such objects as they pointed out, she distinguished no part of the scene. Her thoughts were all fixed on that one spot of Pemberley House, whichever it might be, where Mr. Darcy then was. Elizabeth, however astonished, was at least more prepared for an interview than before, and resolved to appear and to speak with calmness, if he really intended to meet them. Whilst wandering on in this slow manner, they were again surprised, and Elizabeth's astonishment was quite equal to what it had been at first, by the sight of Mr. Darcy approaching them, and at no great distance. Elizabeth longed to explore its windings, but when they had crossed the bridge, and perceived their distance from the house, Mrs. Gardner, who was not a great walker, could go no farther, and thought only of returning to the carriage as quickly as possible. With a glance, she saw that he had lost none of his recent civility, and, to imitate his politeness, she began, as they met, to admire the beauty of the place, but she had not got beyond the words, delightful, and charming, when some unlucky recollections obtruded, and she fancied that praise of Pemberley from her might be mischievously construed. Their visitors stayed with them above half an hour, and when they arose to depart, Mr. Darcy called on his sister to join him in expressing their wish of seeing Mr. and Mrs. Gardner, and Miss Bennet, to dinner at Pemberley, before they left the country. Bingley expressed great pleasure in the certainty of seeing Elizabeth again, having still a great deal to say to her, and many enquiries to make after all their Hertfordshire friends. They could not be untouched by his politeness, and had they drawn his character from their own feelings and his servant's report, without any reference to any other account, the circle in Hertfordshire to which he was known would not have recognised it for Mr. Darcy. With respect to Wickham, the travellers soon found that he was not held there in much estimation, for though the chief of his concerns with the son of his patron were imperfectly understood, it was yet a well-known fact that, on his quitting Derbyshire, he had left many debts behind him, which Mr. Darcy afterwards discharged. As for Elizabeth, her thoughts were at Pemberley this evening more than the last, and the evening, though as it passed it seemed long, was not long enough to determine her feelings towards one in that mansion. She certainly did not hate him. No, hatred had vanished long ago, and she had almost as long been ashamed of ever feeling a dislike against him, that could be so called. The respect created by the conviction of his valuable qualities, though at first unwillingly admitted, had for some time ceased to be repugnant to her feeling. It had been settled in the evening between the aunt and the niece, that such a striking civility as Miss Darcy's in coming to see them on the very day of her arrival at Pemberley, for she had reached it only to a late breakfast, ought to be imitated, though it could not be equalled, by some exertion of politeness on their side, and, consequently, that it would be highly expedient to wait on her at Pemberley the following morning. Elizabeth was pleased, though when she asked herself the reason, she had very little to say in reply. Mr. Gardiner left them soon after breakfast. Miss Darcy looked as if she wished for courage enough to join in it, and sometimes did venture a short sentence when there was least danger of its being heard. She expected every moment that some of the gentlemen would enter the room, she feared they might be among them. It was first broken by Mrs. Annesley, a genteel, agreeable-looking woman, whose endeavour to introduce some kind of discourse proved her to be more truly well-bred than either of the others, and between her and Mrs. Gardiner, with occasional help from Elizabeth, the conversation was carried on. The ladies of the family intended a visit to Georgiana that morning, and Elizabeth decided to be easy and unembarrassed, but no sooner did he appear than her suspicions of the whole party were awakened. Miss Darcy, on her brother's entrance, exerted herself much more to talk, and Elizabeth saw that he was anxious for his sister and herself to get acquainted, and forwarded as much as possible every attempt at conversation on either side. He had been some time with Mr. Gardiner, who, with 2 or 3 other gentlemen from the house, was engaged by the river, and had left him only on learning that the ladies of the family intended a visit to Georgiana that morning. In Darcy's presence she dared not mention Wickham's name, but Elizabeth instantly comprehended that he was uppermost in her thoughts, and the various recollections connected with him gave her a moment's distress, but exerting herself vigorously to repel the ill-natured attack, she presently answered the question in a tolerably detached tone. Georgiana Bingley had intended to discompose Elizabeth Darcy by bringing forward the idea of a man to whom she believed her partial, to make her betray a sensibility which might injure her in Darcy's opinion, and to remind the latter of all the follies and absurdities by which some part of her family were connected with that corpse. "How very ill Miss Eliza Bennet looks this morning, Mr. Darcy," she cried. "I never in my life saw anyone so much altered as she is since the winter. I remember, when we first knew her in Hertfordshire, how amazed we all were to find that she was a reputed beauty, and I particularly recollect your saying one night, after they had been dining at Netherfield, 'She a beauty, I should as soon call her mother a wit. I should as soon call her mother a wit.' Miss Bingley's sister Jane replied, 'Yes, but that was only when I first saw her as one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance.' 'Yes,' replied Darcy, who could contain himself no longer, 'but that was only when I first saw her, for it is many months since I have considered her as one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance.' They talked of his sister, his friends, his house, his fruit, of everything but himself, yet Elizabeth was longing to know what Mrs. Gardiner thought of him, and Mrs. Gardiner would have been highly gratified by her niece's beginning the subject. Colonel Forster was thoughtless and indiscreet, but this step, and let us rejoice over it, marks nothing bad at heart, said Elizabeth. An express came at 12 last night, just as we were all gone to bed, from Colonel Forster, to inform us that she was gone off to Scotland with one of his officers, to own the truth, with Wickham. Lydia Wickham's sister-in-law, Lizzie Foster, writes to her sister, I hardly know what I would write, but I have bad news for you, and it cannot be delayed. Mr. Gardiner, there is no absolute proof that they are not gone to Scotland. Why should they not go on to Scotland if that had been the case? Jane's father, not, perhaps, of neglecting his own interest, but of every other neglect I can believe him capable of. Well, then, supposing them to be in London. It does seem, and it is most shocking indeed, said Elizabeth, with tears in her eyes, that a sister's sense of decency and virtue should admit of doubt. But Jane knows, as well as I do, what Wickham really is. And do you really know all this? Cried Mrs. Gardiner, whose curiosity as to the mode of her intelligence was all alive. I do indeed, replied Elizabeth, colouring. She went on, he must know that she was as amiable and unpretending as we have found her. From what he said of Miss Darcy I was thoroughly prepared to see a proud, reserved, disagreeable girl. And there are other circumstances which I am not at liberty, which it is not worthwhile to relate, but his lies about the whole Pemberley family are endless. Not the slightest. Elizabeth, as she affectionately embraced her, whilst tears filled the eyes of both, lost not a moment in asking whether anything had been heard of the fugitives. The little Gardiners, attracted by the sight of a chaise, were standing on the steps of the house as they entered the paddock, and, when the carriage drove up to the door, the joyful surprise that lighted up their faces, and displayed itself over their whole bodies, in a variety of capers and frisks, was the first pleasing earnest of their welcome. Elizabeth Wickham Bennet, how much you must have gone through? Mrs. Bennet, my mother is tolerably well, I trust, though her spirits are greatly shaken. Lydia, she does not yet leave her dressing room. Mary and Kitty, thank heaven, are quite well. Her sister, however, assured her of her being perfectly well, and their conversation, which had been passing while Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were engaged with their children, was now put an end to by the approach of the whole party. What is to become of us all? The Collinses will turn us out before he is cold in his grave? She asks. And now here's Mr. Bennet gone away, and I know he will fight Wickham, wherever he meets him, and then he will be killed, and what is to become of us all? They all exclaimed against such terrific ideas, and Mr. Gardiner, after general assurances of his affection for her and all her family, told her that he meant to be in London the very next day, and would assist Mr. Bennet in every endeavour for recovering Lydia. After dinner they left her to vent her feelings on the housekeeper, who attended in the absence of her daughters. The Bennet sisters were persuaded that there was no real occasion for such a seclusion from the family. But Mr. Gardiner, though he assured her again of his earnest endeavours in the cause, could not avoid recommending moderation to her, as well in her hopes as her fear, and after talking with her in this manner till dinner was on the table, they all left her to vent all her feelings on the housekeeper, who attended in the absence of her daughters. In the afternoon, the two elder Miss Bennets were able to be for half an hour by themselves, and Elizabeth instantly availed herself of the opportunity of making any enquiries, which Jane was equally eager to satisfy. Jane Foster, Colonel Foster did own that he had often suspected some partiality, especially on Lydia's side, but nothing to give him any alarm. I am so grieved for him. His behavior was attentive and kind to the utmost. Denny denied knowing anything of their plans, and would not give his real opinion about it. He did not repeat his persuasion of their not marrying. Kitty then owned, with a very natural triumph on knowing more than the rest of us, that Lydia's last letter she had prepared her for such a step. She had known, it seems, of their being in love with each other, many weeks, but not before they went to Brighton. And was Denny convinced that Wickham would not marry? He brought it with him for us to see, said Jane, and how he must have felt it. Exclaimed Elizabeth when she saw it. You need not send them word at Longbourn of my going, if you do not like it, for it will make the surprise the greater, when I write to them and sign my name, Lydia Wickham. I hope there was, said Elizabeth, but to be guarded at such a time is very difficult. She went on, your attendance upon her has been too much for you. He meant, I believe, to go to Epsom, the place where they last changed horses, and try if anything could be made out from them, she said. Mr. Gardner had waited only for the letters before he set off. Their other aunt also visited them frequently, and always with the design of cheering and heartening them up. But as she never came without reporting some fresh instance of Wickham's extravagance or irregularity, she seldom went away without leaving them more dispirited than she found them. Elizabeth, though she did not credit above half of what was said, believed enough to make her former assurance of her sister's ruin more certain, and even Jane, who believed still less of it, became almost hopeless, more especially as the time was now come when, if they had gone to Scotland, which she had never before entirely despaired of, they must in all probability have gained some news of them. Mr. Gardner himself did not expect any success from this measure, but as his brother was eager in it, he meant to assist him in pursuing it.
I have written to Colonel Foster to desire him to find out, if possible, from some of the young man's intimates in the regiment, whether Wickham has any relations or connections who would be likely to know in what part of town he has now concealed himself.
She had never heard of his relations, except a father and mother, both of whom were dead many years ago.
But before they heard again from the colonel, a letter arrived for their father, from a different quarter, from Mr. Collins.
Elizabeth was at no loss to understand from whence this deference to her authority proceeded.
But before they heard again from Mr. Gardner, a letter arrived for their father, from a different quarter, from Mr. Collins, which, as Jane had received directions to open all that came for him in his absence, she accordingly read, and Elizabeth, who knew what curiosities his letters always were, looked over her, and read it likewise.
No arguments shall be wanting on my part that can alleviate so severe a misfortune. The death of your daughter would have been a blessing in comparison of this, writes Lord Byron. Howsoever that may be, you are grievously to be pitied, in which opinion I am joined by Mrs. Collins and Lady Catherine. It was not known that Wickham had a single relationship with whom he kept up any connection, and it was certain that he had no near one living. Colonel Foster believed that more than £1,000 would be necessary to clear his expenses at Brighton. He owed a good deal in town, but his debts of honour were still more formidable. When Mrs. Bennet was told of this, she cried, "A gamester!" she cried.
Mr. Gardner added in his letter, that they might expect to see their father at home on the following day, which was Saturday.
Mrs. Gardner went away in all the perplexity about Elizabeth and her Derbyshire friend that had attended her from that part of the world. The coach took them the first stage of their journey to London, and brought its master back to Longbourn. When Mr. Bennet arrived, he said as little as he had ever been in the habit of saying, made no mention of the business that had taken him away.
The present unhappy state of the family rendered any other excuse for the lowness of her spirits unnecessary. Nothing, therefore, could be fairly conjectured from that, though Elizabeth, who was by this time tolerably well acquainted with her own feelings, was perfectly aware that, had she known nothing of Darcy, she could have borne the dread of Lydia's infamy somewhat better.
Elizabeth had received none since her return that could come from Pemberley.
2 days after Mr. Bennet's return, as Jane and Elizabeth were walking together in the shrubbery behind the house, they saw the housekeeper coming towards them, and, concluding that she came to call them to their mother, went forward to meet her, but, instead of the expected summons, when they approached her, she said to Miss Bennet, "I beg your pardon, madam, for interrupting you, but I was in hopes you might have got some good news from town, so I took the liberty of coming to ask." "Dear madam," cried Mrs.
Hill, in great astonishment, "don't you know there is an express come for master from Mr. Gardner?" Elizabeth read on, "I am happy to say there will be some little money, even when all his debts are discharged, to settle on my niece, in addition to her own fortune," she wrote. "Is it possible?" cried Elizabeth, when she had finished. "Wickham is not so undeserving, then, as we thought him," said her sister. "Yours, etc., E.D.W. Gardner. I am only ashamed of his asking so little, yet he is such a man," said Mrs. Bennet, "and they must marry. There is nothing else to be done, and they are really to be married," cried Elizabeth, as soon as they were by themselves. "No," said her father. "Wickham's a fool if he takes her with a farthing less than £10,000. "How could he spare half £10,000? asked Elizabeth, "and how much is settled on his side on our sister?"
asked Jani. If such goodness does not make her miserable now, she will never deserve to be happy, when she first sees my aunt. If he were ever able to learn what Wickham's debts have been, said Elizabeth, and how much is settled on his side on our sister, we shall exactly know what Mr. Gardner has done for them, because Wickham has not sixpence of his own.
Elizabeth took the letter from his writing table, and they went upstairs together. And to see dear Wickham too. I will write to my sister Gardner about them directly. We will settle with your father about the money afterwards, but the things should be ordered immediately, she said. Elizabeth received her congratulations amongst the rest, and then, sick of this folly, took refuge in her own room, that she might think with freedom. Mrs. Wickham. Lydia Bennet was born to one of the most worthless young men in Great Britain. Mr. Bennet wished he had laid by an annual sum for the better provision of his children, and of his wife, if she survived him. Had he done his duty in that respect, Lydia need not have been indebted to her uncle for whatever of honor or credit could be purchased for her. He had never before supposed that, could Wickham be prevailed on to marry his daughter, it would be done with so little inconvenience to himself as by the present arrangement. She was busily searching through the neighborhood for a proper situation for her daughter, and rejected many as deficient in size and importance.
She was more alive to the disgrace which her want of new clothes must reflect on her daughter's nuptials, than to any sense of shame at her eloping and living with Wickham a fortnight before they took place.
Elizabeth Darcy was most heartily sorry that she had been led to make Mr. Darcy acquainted with their fears for her sister's frailty. Lydia's marriage would give the proper termination to the elopement. They might hope to conceal its unfavorable beginning from all those who were not immediately on the spot. The principal purport of his letter was to inform them that Mr. Wickham had resolved on quitting the militia. Mr. Gardner soon wrote again to his brother. It was greatly my wish that he should do so, he writes, as soon as his marriage was fixed on. Mr. Gardner adds, he promises fairly, and I hope among different people, where they may each have a character to preserve, they will both be more prudent. It is Mr. Wickham's intention to go into the regulars, and among his former friends, there are still some who are able and willing to assist him in the army. And their mother had the satisfaction of knowing that she would be able to see her married daughter in the neighborhood before she was banished to the north.
But Jane and Elizabeth, who agreed in wishing, for the sake of their sister's feelings and consequence, that she should be noticed on her marriage by her parents, urged him so earnestly yet so rationally and so mildly, to receive her and her husband at Longbourn, as soon as they were married, that he was prevailed on to think as they thought, and act as they wished.
Elizabeth was surprised, however, that Wickham should consent to such a scheme, and had she consulted only her own inclination, any meeting with him would have been the last object of her wishes. The bridegroom was sent to fetch a carriage to meet them at, and they were to return in it by dinner time. Their sister's wedding day arrived, and Jane and Elizabeth felt for her probably more than she felt for herself. Elizabeth had not before believed him quite equal to such assurance, but she sat down, resolving within herself to draw no limits in future to the impudence of an impudent man.
Wickham was not at all more distressed than herself, but his manners were always so pleasing, that had his character and his marriage been exactly what they ought, his smiles and his easy address, while he claimed their relationship, would have delighted them all.
Lydia was Lydia still, untamed, unabashed, wild, noisy, and fearless. Elizabeth Wickham, daughter of William and Jane, was delighted to see her sister Lydia walk up to her mother's right hand as she said, "Ah, Jane, I take your place now, and you must go lower, because I am a married woman." Elizabeth could bear it no longer. She got up, and ran out of the room, and returned no more, till she heard them passing through the hall to the dining parlour. One morning, soon after their arrival, as she was sitting with her two elder sisters, she said to Elizabeth, Mr. Wickham had received his commission before he left London, and he was to join his regiment at the end of a fortnight. Wickham's affection for Lydia was just what Elizabeth had expected to find it, not equal to Lydia's for him. I was so frightened I did not know what to do, for my uncle was to give me away, and if we were beyond the hour, we could not be married all day, says Elizabeth. However, I recollected afterwards that if he had been prevented going, the wedding need not be put off, for Mr. Darcy might have done as well. However, I did not hear above 1 word in 10, for I was thinking, you may suppose, of my dear Wickham.
Jane's delicate sense of honor would not allow her to speak to Elizabeth privately of what Lydia had let fall. Elizabeth was glad of it, till it appeared whether her inquiries would receive any satisfaction. She had rather be without a confidant.
Mr. Darcy had been at her sister's wedding. What will Wickham say? Elizabeth had the satisfaction of receiving an answer to her letter as soon as she possibly could. Mr. Darcy wrote that he was surprised by your application. I did not expect it from you. He went on to say, if you are really innocent and ignorant, I must be more explicit.
The motive professed was his conviction of its being owing to himself that Wickham's worthlessness had not been so well known as to make it impossible for any girl of character to love or confide in him.
He came to tell Mr. Gardiner that he had found out where your sister and Mr. Wickham were, and that he had seen and talked with them both. Wickham repeatedly, Lydia once. Mrs. Young was a governess to Miss Darcy, and was dismissed from her charge on some cause of disapprobation. She lived in a large house in Edward Street, and has since maintained herself by letting lodgings. Wickham went to her for intelligence of him as soon as he got to town, but it was 2 or 3 days before he could get from her what he wanted. He found Lydia absolutely resolved on remaining where she was. She cared for none of her friends. She wanted no help of his. She would not hear of leaving Wickham. At length, however, our kind friend procured the wished-for direction. When Mr. Darcy met Mr. Wickham Gardiner, he asked him why he had not married your sister at once. He found that Mr. Gardiner still cherished the hope of more effectually making his fortune by marriage in some other country. I really believe your letter this morning gave him great pleasure, because it required an explanation that would rob him of his borrowed feathers, and give the praise where it was due. Jane Austen writes to her niece Lizzie. Wickham's character had been so misunderstood, that he had been received and noticed as he was. Perhaps there was some truth in this, though I doubt whether his reserve or anybody's reserve can be answerable for the event. Elizabeth Darcy Gardiner. I talked to her repeatedly in the most serious manner, representing to her all the wickedness of what she had done, and all the unhappiness she had brought on her family. Mr. Darcy was punctual in his return, and as Lydia informed you, attended the wedding. He dined with us the next day, and was to leave town again on Wednesday or Thursday. The children have been wanting me this half hour. I must write no more. Lydia came to us, and Wickham had constant admission to the house. The contents of this letter threw Elizabeth into a flutter of spirits, in which it was difficult to determine whether pleasure or pain bore the greatest share. Her heart did whisper that he had done it for her, but she soon felt that even her vanity was insufficient. Every kind of pride must revolt from the connection. The vague and unsettled suspicions which uncertainty had produced of what Mr. Darcy might have been doing to forward her sister's match, which she had feared to encourage as an exertion of goodness too great to be probable, and at the same time dreaded to be just, from the pain of obligation, were proved beyond their greatest extent to be true. Brother-in-law of Wickham. They owed the restoration of Lydia, her character, everything, to him. Mrs. Bennet said to her sister, "Don't imagine it was from any silly cause. I was only confused for the moment, because I felt that I should be looked at." But Elizabeth could easily perceive that her spirits were disturbed, more unequal, than she had often seen them. Jane resolutely kept her place at the table, but Elizabeth, to satisfy her mother, went to the window. She looked, she saw Mr. Darcy with him, and sat down again by her sister. Their mother, Mrs. Gardiner, told them of her dislike of Mr. Darcy, and her resolution to be civil to him only as a friend. But Elizabeth had sources of uneasiness which could not be suspected by Jane. Elizabeth said as little to either as civility would allow, and sat down again to her work, with an eagerness which it did not often command. Darcy, after inquiring of her how Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner did, a question which she could not answer without confusion, said scarcely anything. Elizabeth dared not lift up her eyes. How Mr. Darcy looked, therefore, she could not tell. It was my brother Gardiner's drawing up to, and I wonder how he came to make such an awkward business of it. Miss Lucas is married and settled. Elizabeth's misery increased, at such unnecessary, such officious attention. When you have killed all your own birds, Mr. Bingley, said her mother, I beg you will come here and shoot as many as you please on Mr. Bennet's manor. At that instant, she felt that years of happiness could not make Jane herself amends for moments of such painful confusion. Mr. Darcy's behavior astonished and vexed Mrs. Bennet. She could settle it in no way that gave her pleasure. Why, if he came only to be silent, grave, and indifferent, why did he come at all? She asked herself. Yes, very indifferent indeed, said Elizabeth, laughingly. Mr. Darcy's behavior to his sister Jane was such as showed an admiration of her, which, though more guarded than formerly, persuaded Elizabeth that if left wholly to himself, Jane's happiness, and his own, would be speedily secured. When they repaired to the dining room, Elizabeth eagerly watched to see whether Bingley would take the place, which had belonged to him, by her sister. Her prudent mother forbore to invite him to sit by herself. She looked forward to their entrance as the point on which all her chance of pleasure for the evening must depend. The ladies had crowded round the table, Miss Bennet making tea, and Elizabeth pouring out the coffee, in so close a confederacy that there was not a single chair near her. Darcy had walked away to another part of the room. Elizabeth smiled. Mrs. Bennet, in short, was in very great spirits. She had seen enough of Bingley's behavior to Jane, to be convinced that she would get him at last, and her expectations of advantage to her family, when in a happy humor, were so far beyond reason, that she was quite disappointed at not seeing him there again the next day, to make his proposals. Ah, Mrs. Bennet, we shall have her at Netherfield at last. The soup was 50 times better than what we had at the Lucases last week, and even Mr. Darcy acknowledged that the partridges were remarkably well done, and I suppose he has 2 or 3 French cooks at least. Mrs. Bennet, I am perfectly satisfied, from what his manners now are, that he never had any design of engaging my affection. Mr. Bingley, it is only that he is blessed with greater sweetness of address, and a stronger desire of generally pleasing, than any other man. Miss Bennet's sister Sarah, you are very cruel, said her sister, you will not let me smile, and are provoking me to it every moment. Mrs. Bennet's anxiety to get them by themselves was visible again in the evening as she tried to get Elizabeth and Catherine alone. When her mother was gone, Jane would not be prevailed on to go down without one of her sisters. Oh, hang Kitty. What has she to do with it? Come, be quick, be quick. Where is your sash, my dear? Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy spent the morning together, as had been agreed on, and Bingley was punctual to his appointment. Mrs. Bennet's invention was again at work to get everybody away from him and her daughter. After this day, Jane said no more of her indifference to Bingley, but Elizabeth went to bed in the happy belief that all must speedily be concluded, unless he returned. Lizzie, to know that what I have to relate will give such pleasure to all my dear family. How shall I bear so much happiness? Elizabeth, who was left by herself, now smiled at the rapidity and ease with which an affair was finally settled, that had given them so many previous months of suspense and vexation. Imprudence or thoughtlessness in money matters would be unpardonable in me. Elizabeth honestly and heartily expressed her delight in the prospect of their relationship. Mrs. Bennet could not give her consent or speak her approbation in terms warm enough to satisfy her feelings, though she talked to Bingley of nothing else for half an hour, and when Mr. Bennet joined them at supper, his voice and manner plainly showed how really happy he was. Oh, my dear, dear Jane, I am so happy. I am sure I shan't get a wink of sleep all night. She cried. I suspected as much, replied Elizabeth. My dear Mr. Bennet, cried his wife, what are you talking of? Elizabeth Bennet, it would vex me, indeed, to see you again the dupe of Miss Bingley's pretended regard. Lizzie, why am I thus singled from my family, and blessed above them all? If there were but such another man for you. No, no, let me shift for myself, and, perhaps, if I have very good luck, I may meet with another Mr. Collins in time. She entered with an air more than usually ungracious, made no other reply to Miss Bennet's salutation, and sat down without saying a word. Ms. Bennet had mentioned her name to her mother on her ladyship's entrance, though no introduction had been made. After sitting for a moment in silence, she said very stiffly to Elizabeth, I hope you are well, Miss Bennet. She then said she would be glad to spend the evening in a prettyish kind of a little wilderness on one side of your lawn. Elizabeth now expected that she would produce a letter for her from Charlotte, as it seemed the only probable motive for her calling. Mrs. Bennet, with great civility, begged her ladyship to take some refreshment, but Lady Catherine very resolutely, and not very politely, declined eating anything, and then, rising up, said to Elizabeth, Miss Bennet, there seemed to be a prettyish kind of a little wilderness on one side of your lawn. Mrs. Bennet assured her that they never sat there after dinner, and then added, May I take the liberty of asking your ladyship whether you left Mr. and Mrs. Collins well? Miss Bennet, replied her ladyship, in an angry tone, you ought to know, that I am not to be trifled with. Elizabeth Darcy, I know it must be a scandalous falsehood, though I would not injure him so much as to suppose the truth of it possible. Miss Bennet, do you know who I am? Lady Catherine Bennet. If Mr. Darcy is neither by honour nor inclination confined to his cousin, why is not he to make another choice? And if I am that choice, why may I accept him? I am ashamed of you. Lady Catherine Bennet, is this your gratitude for my attentions to you last spring? Is nothing due to me on that score? Elizabeth, you are to understand, Miss Bennet, that I came here with the determined resolution of carrying my purpose. But the wife of Mr. Darcy must have such extraordinary sources of happiness necessarily attached to her situation, that she could, upon the whole, have no cause to repine. Miss Bennet, I am shocked and astonished. But do not deceive yourself into a belief that I will ever recede, she writes to her aunt. Your ladyship wants Mr. Darcy to marry your daughter, but would my giving you the wished-for promise make their marriage at all more probable? Lady Catherine Bennet Collins Darcy, you refuse to obey the claims of duty, honour, and gratitude. You are determined to ruin him in the opinion of all his friends, and make him the contempt of the world. Miss Bennet, I am only resolved to act in that manner, which will, in my own opinion, constitute my happiness, without reference to you, or to any person so wholly unconnected with me. Neither duty, nor honour, nor gratitude, replied Elizabeth, have any possible claim on me in the present instance. But from what the report of their engagement could originate, Elizabeth was at a loss to imagine, till she recollected that his being the intimate friend of Bingley, and her being the sister of Jane, was enough, at a time when the expectation of one wedding made everybody eager for another, to supply the idea. Lady Catherine, it appeared, had actually taken the trouble of this journey from Rosings, for the sole purpose of breaking off her supposed engagement with Mr. Darcy. And her neighbours at Lucas Lodge, therefore, for through their communication with the Collinses, the report, she concluded, had reached Lady Catherine, had only set that down as almost certain and immediate, which she had looked forward to as possible at some future time. Elizabeth Bennet, if he is satisfied with only regretting me, when he might have obtained my affections and hand, I shall soon cease to regret him at all. Lady Catherine, in that case he would return no more. Lady Catherine might see him in her way through town, and his engagement to Bingley must give way. Your daughter Elizabeth, it is presumed, will not long bear the name of Bennet, after her elder sister has resigned it, and the chosen partner of her fate may be reasonably looked up to as one of the most illustrious personages in this land. This letter is from Mr. Collins. Yet in spite of all these temptations, let me warn my cousin Elizabeth, and yourself, of what evils you may incur by a precipitate closure with this gentleman's proposals, which, of course, you will be inclined to take immediate advantage of. He says, we have reason to imagine that his aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, does not look on the match with a friendly eye. Lizzie tries to join in her father's pleasantry, but only manages one smile. Mr. Darcy, you see, is the man. Mrs. Collins said she did not enjoy it. Oh, cried Elizabeth, I am excessively diverted. It is so strange. Mrs. Bennet was so cruelly mortified by the question that she laughed and said, I am a very selfish creature, and for the sake of giving relief to my own feelings, care not how much I may be wounding yours. Elizabeth had never been more at a loss to make her feelings appear what they were not. Now was the moment for her resolution to be executed, and, while her courage was high, she immediately said, Mr. Darcy, I am a very selfish creature, and, for the sake of giving relief to my own feelings, care not how much I may be wounding yours. I did not think Mrs. Gardiner was so little to be trusted, said Mr. Darcy. You must not blame my aunt. Elizabeth, feeling all the more than common awkwardness and anxiety of his situation, now forced herself to speak, and immediately, though not very fluently, gave him to understand that her sentiments had undergone so material a change, since the period to which he alluded, as to make her receive with gratitude and pleasure his present assurances. After abusing you so abominably to your face, I could have no scruple in abusing you to all your relations, he said. We will not quarrel for the greater share of blame annexed to that evening, said Elizabeth. Darcy, I can easily believe it. The turn of your countenance I shall never forget, as you said that I could not have addressed you in any possible way that would induce you to accept me. Jane Austen, oh, do not repeat what I then said, these recollections will not do at all. I assure you that I have long been most heartily ashamed of it. What do I owe you, dearest, loveliest Elizabeth? What do I not owe you? I have been a selfish being all my life, in practice, though not in principle, he says. As a child I was taught what was right, but not taught to correct my temper. I was given good principles, but left to follow them in pride and conceit. My object was to show you, by every civility in my power, that I was not so mean as to resent the past, said Mr. Darcy. I must ask whether you were surprised, said Elizabeth. My dear Lizzie, where can you have been walking to? Was a question which Elizabeth received from Jane as soon as she entered their room, and from all the others when they sat down to table. You are joking, Lizzie. This cannot be. Engaged to Mr. Darcy. No, no, you shall not deceive me, said Jane Bennet. Elizabeth again, and more seriously assured her of its truth. Miss Bennet still looked all amazement. You will only think I feel more than I ought to do, when I tell you all. Miss Bennet, what can he mean by being so tiresome as to be always coming here? What shall we do with him? Elizabeth told her the motives of her secrecy. Good gracious, cried Mrs. Bennet, as she stood at a window the next morning, if that disagreeable Mr. Darcy is not coming here again with our dear Bingley. Elizabeth reserved to herself the application for her mothers. I advise Mr. Darcy, and Lizzie, and Kitty, said Mrs. Bennet, to walk to Oakham Mount this morning. In the evening, soon after Mr. Bennet withdrew to the library, she saw Mr. Darcy rise also and follow him, and her agitation on seeing it was extreme. I do like him. Have you any other objection, said Elizabeth, than your belief of my indifference? None at all? She did not fear her father's opposition, but he was going to be made unhappy, and that it should be through her means, that she, his favorite child, should be distressing him by her choice, should be filling him with fears and regrets in disposing of her, was a wretched reflection, and she sat in misery till Mr. Darcy appeared again, when, looking at him, she was a little relieved by his smile. He went on, I know your disposition, Lizzie. I know that you could be neither happy nor respectable, unless you truly esteemed your husband, unless you looked up to him as a superior. My child, let me not have the grief of seeing you unable to respect your partner in life. You know not what you are about? Elizabeth, still more affected, was earnest and solemn in her reply, and at length, by repeated assurances that Mr. Darcy was really the object of her choice, by explaining the gradual change which her estimation of him had undergone, relating her absolute certainty that his affection was not the work of a day, but had stood the test of many months' suspense, and enumerating with energy all his good qualities, she did conquer her father's incredulity, and reconcile him to the match. He then recollected her embarrassment a few days before, on his reading Mr. Collins's letter, and after laughing at her some time, allowed her at last to go, saying, as she quitted the room, if any young men come for Mary or Kitty, send them in, for I am quite at leisure. This was enough to prove that her approbation need not be doubted, and Elizabeth, rejoicing that such an effusion was heard only by herself, soon went away. Mr. Darcy, its effect was most extraordinary, for on first hearing it, Mrs. Bennet sat quite still, and unable to utter a syllable. My dearest child, I can think of nothing else. 'Tis as good as a lord, she cried. This was a sad omen of what her mother's behavior to the gentleman himself might be, and Elizabeth found that, though in the certain possession of his warmest affection, and secure of her relations' consent, there was still something to be wished for. But my dearest love, tell me what dish Mr. Darcy is particularly fond of, that I may have it tomorrow. Elizabeth had the satisfaction of seeing her father taking pains to get acquainted with him, and Mr. Bennet soon assured her that he was rising every hour in his esteem. She replied, "Did you admire me for my impertinence?" He replied, "For the liveliness of your mind, I did." "Was there no good in your affectionate behavior to Jane while she was ill at Netherfield?" Elizabeth's spirits soon rising to playfulness again, she wanted Mr. Darcy to account for his having ever fallen in love with her. "My good qualities are under your protection, and you are to exaggerate them as much as possible, and, in return, it belongs to me to find occasions for teasing and quarrelling with you as often as may be. Lady Catherine has been of infinite use, which ought to make her happy, for she loves to be of use." She was almost ashamed to find that her uncle and aunt had lost 3 days of happiness, and immediately wrote as follows, "Shall you ever have courage to announce to Lady Catherine what is to befall her? I am more likely to want more time than courage, Elizabeth. Mr. Darcy sends you all the love in the world that he can spare from me." Mr. Darcy's letter to Lady Catherine was in a different style, and still different from either was what Mr. Bennet sent to Mr. Collins, in reply to his last. Miss Bingley's congratulations to her brother, on his marriage, were affectionate and insincere. Jane was not deceived, but she was affected, and could not help writing her a much kinder answer than she knew was deserved. Lady Catherine had been rendered so exceedingly angry by the contents of her nephew's letter, that Charlotte, rejoicing in the match, was anxious to leave till the storm was blown over. At such a moment, the arrival of her friend was a sincere pleasure to Elizabeth, though in the course of their meetings she must sometimes think the pleasure dearly bought, when she saw Mr. Darcy exposed to all the parading and obsequious civility of her husband. Mr. Darcy's good humour was another tax on his forbearance, and Mrs. Bennet did all she could to shield him from the frequent notice of either, and was ever anxious to keep him to herself, and to those of her family with whom he might converse without mortification. His affection for her drew him oftener from home than anything else could do. He delighted in going to Pemberley when he was least expected. Elizabeth did all she could to shield him from the frequent notice of either, and was ever anxious to keep him to herself, and to those of her family with whom he might converse without mortification, and though the uncomfortable feelings arising from all this took from the season of courtship much of its pleasure, it added to the hope of the future, and she looked forward with delight to the time when they should be removed from society so little pleasing to either, to all the comfort and elegance of their family party at Pemberley. Elizabeth Darcy Bennet became less irritable, less ignorant, and less insipid. Kitty was not of so ungovernable a temper as Lydia. Mary was drawn from the pursuit of accomplishments by Mrs. Bennet's being quite unable to sit alone. As it happened that Elizabeth had much rather not, she endeavoured in her answer to put an end to every entreaty and expectation of the kind. Though Darcy could never receive him at Pemberley, yet, for Elizabeth's sake, he assisted him further in his profession. By Elizabeth's instructions, she began to comprehend that a woman may take liberties with her husband which a brother will not always allow in a sister more than 10 years younger than himself. Darcy, as well as Elizabeth, really loved them, and they were both ever sensible of the warmest gratitude towards the persons who, by bringing her into Derbyshire, had been the means of uniting them. Lady Catherine was extremely indignant on the marriage of her nephew, and as she gave way to all the genuine frankness of her character in her reply to the letter which announced its arrangement, she sent him language so very abusive, especially of Elizabeth, that for some time all intercourse was at an end. Thanks for listening and liking this audiobook. Its arrangement, she sent him language so very abusive, especially of Elizabeth, that for some time all intercourse was at an end. Thanks for listening and liking this audiobook.